Let the day fade away. Settle into your bed or favorite chair, lower the lights, and let's take a slow journey into the past. We'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment if you'd like to share. You're standing at the edge of a rice field, the morning mist rolling in like a soft blanket, obscuring the rows of green that stretch into the distance. It's the Heian period, and if you're feeling the weight of time, that's because it's around 794 to 185 AD. This era is like Japan's awkward teenage years. It's dramatic, transformative, and full of growing pains. You see, the Heian period wasn't just about elegant court life and poetry. It was the stage for a seismic shift in power dynamics that would eventually give birth to the samurai, those iconic warriors who, despite their noble image, were more Game of Thrones' cutthroat than Last Samurai noble. Let's set the scene. The capital is Kyoto, back then called Heian-kyo, and it's the epicenter of power. But here's the twist. While the emperor sits on the chrysanthemum throne, real power is slipping through his fingers like sand. You've got aristocratic families, like the Fujiwara clan, pulling the strings behind the scenes. They're the puppet masters, marrying their daughters into the imperial family to ensure that the emperor is more of a figurehead than a ruler. Think of them as the ultimate in-laws from hell, with ambitions as vast as their estates. Speaking of estates, let's talk land, the ancient world's version of Bitcoin. Land isn't just dirt and crops, it's power, wealth, and influence wrapped in one. In Heian Japan, those who controlled the land controlled the purse strings, and by extension, the military power. Land was parcelled out in vast estates called shuin, and the more shuin you had, the more clout you wielded. And who were the gatekeepers of these estates? You guessed it, our friends the Fujiwara and other aristocratic families. They collected taxes and managed these estates, making them the Bill Gates of their time. Now, here's where the plot thickens. These estates needed protection. Enter the samurai, who were initially just hired muscle, glorified security guards, if you will. But in a world where the phrase, "you and what army?" was a legitimate question, these samurai began to realize their own power. They weren't just wielding swords, they were wielding influence. The romantic notion of the samurai as honorable warriors following the Bushido code is a tad misleading. Sure, they had their code of conduct, but in reality they were as much about political maneuvering as they were about martial prowess. These guys were the medieval Japanese equivalent of power brokers, cutting deals, forging alliances, and occasionally, taking heads. The samurai weren't born from some mystical warrior ethos. They were forged in the crucible of necessity and opportunity. And as they accumulated land and power, they began to challenge the aristocratic families for dominance. Think of the samurai as the ultimate opportunists. By the end of the Heian period, they were no longer content with being the muscle. They wanted a piece of the political pie. And by the Kamakura period, which kicked off in 1185, they got it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll save that saga for another time. The Rise of the Samurai is a classic tale of social mobility, one that would have made Machiavelli proud. It's about leveraging military might into political power, about turning service into sovereignty. And all of this was happening while the court was busy writing poetry and playing the world's longest game of politics. The emperor may have had the divine right to rule, but it was the samurai who had the swords. And in a world where actions spoke louder than words, that made all the difference. So, next time you hear the word samurai, think less noble knight of the East and more ruthless real estate mogul with the swords. They were the original disruptors, turning Japan's feudal system on its head and setting the stage for centuries of warrior rule. And it all started here, in the misty fields of the Heian period, where land was power and power was everything. And so, as the mist lifted on the Heian fields, the curtains rose on a new era, the Kamakura period, starting in 1185, where shoguns were the real stars of Japan's political drama. The emperor? Well, he was still around, sitting on that chrysanthemum throne. But let's just say his role had more to do with ceremonial pomp than actual governance. Picture a CEO who spends more time cutting ribbons at store openings than making decisions in the boardroom. Enter the shogunate, the de facto military government led by the shogun, a title meaning commander of the armies. Think of the shogun as the ultimate power broker, the Steve Jobs of his time, innovative, authoritative, and with a monopoly on military might. The first to seize this mantle was Minamoto no Yoritomo, a man who knew how to leverage a good old-fashioned family feud into a nationwide power grab. He set up shop in Kamakura, a city nestled between mountains and the sea, far from the imperial court's reach in Kyoto. This geographical shift was more than symbolic, it was strategic. By 1192, Yoritomo had established the first shogunate, a military government that would define Japanese politics for centuries. But let's not pretend this was a seamless transition. The Kamakura period was a hotbed of intrigue, with clans vying for dominance like contestants on a feudal survivor island. Despite the shogun's apparent control, the reality was a tangled web of alliances, betrayals, and backstabbing, sometimes literally. If you think Game of Thrones had complex family dynamics, you haven't met the Hojo clan. After Yoritomo's death, they pulled a classic power move, effectively controlling the shogunate by acting as regents for Yoritomo's descendants, who were often too young or too weak to rule on their own. And while the power plays were happening at the top, let's not forget the common folk, the peasants, the backbone of feudal Japan. These were the guys and gals toiling away in the fields, providing the rice that fueled the economy. But life wasn't exactly sunny for them, unless you count working under a blazing sun. Heavy taxes weighed on their shoulders like a sack of rice, thanks to the Shuin system, which allowed tax-free estates to proliferate. The result? More pressure on the peasantry to cough up their hard-earned produce. If you think your tax return is complicated, try paying in rice while dodging droughts and samurai demands. Now, fast forward to the late 13th century, when the Mongol Empire, led by Kublai Khan, decided it fancied Japan as its next conquest. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 are often painted as epic clashes between samurai and Mongol warriors. But the real MVPs of these stories? Typhoons, or as the Japanese called them, kamikaze, meaning divine wind. These storms wrecked the Mongol fleets not once, but twice, making the weather the ultimate defense mechanism. Forget samurai swords and archery, it was Mother Nature who had the final say, saving Japan from becoming just another province in the Mongol Empire. It's a bit like showing up to a fight, only to have the universe itself step in, like a bouncer tossing out the unruly patrons. As the Mongol threat receded, the Kamakura shogunate faced a new enemy economic strain. The cost of defending against the Mongols had drained the coffers, and the samurai, expecting land and rewards for their service, found themselves empty-handed. This discontent simmered like a pot on the verge of boiling over, leading to unrest and setting the stage for the next phase of Japan's feudal saga. Enter the Muromachi period, beginning in 1336. This era was named after the district in Kyoto where the Ashikaga shogunate established its headquarters. While the Kamakura shogunate had been a pioneer, the Ashikaga shogunate was more like a juggler with too many balls in the air. The constant balancing act between military power and aristocratic influence meant that the shogunate's grip on power was about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. The Muromachi period saw economic shifts as well. The rise of trade and the merchant class began to reshape the landscape, even as the peasantry continued to bear the brunt of taxation. The Ashikaga shogunate tried to stabilize the economy through the issuance of currency and the control of key trade routes, but their efforts were often undermined by internal strife and the increasing power of regional daimyos, the feudal lords who wielded significant influence in their own domains. And so, the saga of shoguns and emperors, of storms and swords, continued to unfold in a land where the lines between legend and reality blurred like ink on a wet page. As we leave this chapter, remember, the history of feudal Japan is not just a tale of battles and borders, but of economic pressures and the human struggle for power. The stage is set for even more upheaval as the next act in this drama promises new players and fresh twists. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. As we leave the Muromachi period, a time when trying to keep power was like juggling flaming swords while blindfolded, we stumble into the Sengoku period. This era, spanning roughly from 1467 to 1605, is like Japan's version of a reality TV show on steroids. Here, every daimyo worth his weight in koku, the measure of rice that defined wealth back then, was battling it out for supremacy. Picture this. Japan is less a unified nation and more a chaotic patchwork quilt of rival warlords, each with dreams of grandeur and an army of samurai ready to turn those dreams into reality, or, more likely, a bloody nightmare. Now, let's talk about these daimyos. They were the feudal lords who ruled over their domains with a kind of authority that would make modern CEOs weep with envy. But don't let the title fool you into thinking they were sipping tea and writing haikus all day. These were hardened warriors whose idea of a good time was annexing their neighbour's territory and adding a few more castles to their collection. To give you a sense of scale, there were over 200 such domains at the height of the Sengoku period, each with its own unique blend of chaos and ambition. Enter Oda Nobunaga, a name that still echoes through the halls of history like the sound of 1,000 swords clashing. Nobunaga was born in 1534, a time when Japan was in the throes of civil war, a tinderbox of conflict waiting for the right spark. He was the quintessential disruptor, a man with vision, ambition, and the kind of audacity that would make even the most daring Silicon Valley entrepreneur blush. By 1560, he was already making waves, defeating a rival clan in the Battle of Okahazama with a force of just 3,000 against an army of 25,000. Talk about punching above your weight class. Nobunaga's secret weapon? Firearms. Yes, the arquebus, a type of early musket that was as likely to misfire as it was to shoot straight, but when it worked, it was revolutionary. The Portuguese had introduced these firearms to Japan in 1543, and while many samurai scoffed at the idea of replacing their trusty katana with a noisy, smoke-belching contraption, Nobunaga saw the future. He was the first warlord to effectively deploy firearms in battle, using them to devastating effect. In 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, his forces used a wall of arquebusiers to mow down the enemy cavalry, proving once and for all that bullets beat blades. But Nobunaga wasn't just about military innovation, he was also a master of political strategy. He understood that to unify Japan he needed more than brute force, he needed alliances. Through a cunning mix of diplomacy, intimidation, and sheer charisma, he began to consolidate power, swallowing up smaller domains like a black hole devours stars. By the time of his death in 1582, a betrayal by one of his own generals, not some glorious battlefield end, Nobunaga had laid the groundwork for a centralized power structure, paving the way for the eventual unification of Japan. Of course, Nobunaga's story is only the beginning. His death left a power vacuum, a tantalizing opportunity for the next ambitious daimyo to step up and seize the reins. Enter Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of humble origins who clawed his way up from being a sandal-bearer to become one of the most powerful men in Japan. Hideyoshi continued Nobunaga's work with a savvy mix of diplomacy and military might, eventually cementing his hold over Japan by 1590. He even attempted to invade Korea, though that endeavor was about as successful as trying to herd cats. Hideyoshi's rule was marked by a series of reforms designed to stabilize and strengthen the country. He conducted the first nationwide land survey, a move that not only allowed him to tax effectively, but also kept the daimyos in check by limiting their power. He also imposed a rigid class system, ensuring that the samurai remained distinct from the peasants, all in the name of social order. But his most enduring legacy? The sword hunt, a policy that disarmed the peasantry and ensured that only the samurai class had the right to bear arms. This move was both practical, reducing the risk of peasant uprisings, and symbolic, solidifying the samurai's status as the warrior elite. Despite these achievements, Hideyoshi's dreams of a lasting dynasty were dashed by his untimely death in 1598 and the fact that his heir was a mere child. Once again, Japan faced the looming spectre of civil war. Enter Tokugawa Ieyasu, a shrewd strategist who had bided his time, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. In 1600, at the Battle of Sekigahara, Ieyasu defeated his rivals in a clash that was as dramatic as it was decisive, effectively ending the Sengoku period. With Ieyasu's victory, the Tokugawa shogunate was established in 1603, ushering in a new era of peace and stability known as the Edo period. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, that's a story for another day. For now, as we leave the chaotic battlefields of the Sengoku period, remember that this was a time defined not just by warfare and ambition, but by innovation and transformation. It was a crucible in which the future of Japan was forged, where the clang of steel and the crack of gunfire echoed across the land, shaping a nation that was on the brink of greatness. Stay tuned, because the saga of Japan's unification is far from over. As the dust settled on the chaotic battlefields of the Sengoku period, we find ourselves in a Japan that's finally catching its breath. The Tokugawa shogunate, established in 1603 by Tokugawa Ieyasu, is like a giant exhaling after a marathon of war, ready to usher in an era of peace and stability. But don't get too comfortable. This isn't a utopian fairy tale. The Tokugawa era, also known as the Edo period, isn't just about peace. It's about control, social hierarchy, and a Loctite isolationism that would make even a hermit blush. Imagine Japan as a tightly wound clock, each tick representing the meticulous control exerted by the shogunate. Ieyasu, a master of patience and strategy, didn't just want peace. He wanted a long-term plan. His approach? Keep everything and everyone in their place. The shogunate established a rigid class system that was as flexible as a steel beam. Samurais at the top, followed by farmers, artisans and merchants. You might be wondering, why farmers above merchants? Because rice was the currency of power, and merchants were seen as leeches living off the labour of others. Talk about a tough gig. This social order wasn't just for show. It was enforced with the precision of a samurai sword. The Sanken Kotai system, for instance, required daimyos, the feudal lords, to spend every other year in Edo, now Tokyo, leaving their families behind as collateral. Think of it as a medieval game of Monopoly, where you pay in time and loyalty instead of money. This not only drained the daimyos' coffers, but also kept them too busy travelling and financially strapped to start any rebellions. Smart, right? But it was also a recipe for resentment simmering beneath the surface. Now, let's dive into the infamous isolationist policies of the Tokugawa shogunate. In 1635, the Sakoku Edict slammed Japan's doors shut tighter than a vault, allowing minimal trade with a few select foreign powers. The Dutch and Chinese were given limited access to the trading post at Dejima, a man-made island in Nagasaki Bay, while everyone else was left out in the cold. This wasn't about xenophobia as much as it was about control, keeping foreign influence from upsetting the carefully balanced apple cart that was Tokugawa Japan. But this isolationism wasn't just about keeping foreigners out. It was about keeping ideas, especially those pesky Christian ones, at bay. Christianity was seen as a threat to the shogunate's authority, a foreign ideology that could potentially unify the populace against the existing power structure. In fact, Christianity was outlawed entirely, and those caught practicing it faced persecution harsher than a samurai's blade. We're talking forced conversions, torture, and executions. The shogunate wasn't messing around. You might think all this control would lead to a harmonious society, but let's debunk that myth right now. The Tokugawa period was less about Zen-like tranquility and more about walking a tightrope over a pit of social tension. The rigid class structure meant limited social mobility, and while some samurais were busy polishing their swords, others were struggling to make ends meet because their traditional income land and rice wasn't always enough. Many samurai found themselves having to work side gigs as bureaucrats or teachers just to keep their heads above water. So much for the noble warrior image. Meanwhile, merchants, despite their low social standing, were quietly amassing wealth that would make a daimyo jealous. They became the silent powerhouses of the economy, their influence growing like a well-tended bonsai, while the samurai class watched in frustration, shackled by tradition. Picture a samurai, proud in armor, but secretly envious of the merchant counting his coins. Oh, the irony. At the heart of it all was Edo, the bustling hub of Tokugawa power. By the 18th century, Edo had transformed into one of the world's largest cities with a population of over 1 million. It was a city of contrasts, where the rigid social order met vibrant urban culture. The floating world of ukiyo-e, kabuki theatre, and sumo wrestling offered an escape from the everyday grind, a chance for people to indulge in the art of living, even if just for a night. But life in Edo wasn't a constant carnival. For many, it was a daily grind of subsistence, with strict regulations dictating everything from clothing to hairstyles based on your social class. The shogunate's grip was as firm as ever, even as the city buzzed with the hum of commerce and culture. Yet, beneath the surface, the seeds of change were already being sown. As the years rolled on, the rigid structures of Tokugawa Japan began to show cracks. The economy was shifting, the merchant class was rising, and the world outside was changing faster than the shogunate could tighten its grip. But that's a tale for another time, as we journey towards the next chapter in this complex saga of power, peace, and the human spirit. Stay tuned, because the story of Japan's transformation under the Tokugawa shogunate is far from over. And so, the story continues. The Tokugawa shogunate's iron grip, while effective at maintaining peace, was also a straitjacket on progress. By the mid-19th century, the world around Japan had evolved into a bustling symphony of steam engines, telegraphs, and industrial revolutions, while Japan was still playing a solitary tune of rice paddies and rigid social hierarchies. Enter Commodore Matthew Perry, not to be confused with the Friends actor, but just as pivotal in his own right. In 1853, Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with a fleet of U.S. specie warships, his arrival as subtle as a bull in a china shop, demanding that Japan open its doors to trade or face the consequences. Perry's arrival was the diplomatic equivalent of an uninvited guest showing up at your meticulously planned dinner party, only he's brought a cannon or two. The shogunate, confronted with the undeniable might of Western technology and military power, had little choice but to acquiesce. In 1854, the Convention of Kanagawa was signed, marking the end of over 2 centuries of Japanese isolation. The floodgates were open, and the tides of change were rushing in faster than a samurai could draw his sword. The arrival of Perry and the forced opening of Japan to the west was a revelation, a catalyst that sparked a series of events leading to the Meiji Restoration. It was as if Japan, having been in a deep slumber, was suddenly jolted awake by the harsh light of modernity. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had once seemed as immovable as Mount Fuji, began to crumble under the weight of external pressures and internal dissent. The unequal treaties signed with Western powers were a bitter pill to swallow, igniting nationalist fervour and a desire to reclaim Japan's sovereignty. In 1868, the shogunate finally fell, swept away by a wave of reformist sentiment and the rise of Emperor Meiji. The Meiji Restoration was a revolution in all but name, a radical transformation that sought to modernize Japan by borrowing the best elements of Western technology and governance while preserving its unique cultural identity. It's like Japan went on a global shopping spree, picking up industrialization from the British, military organization from the Germans, and constitutional government from the Americans, all while keeping its traditional soul intact. Economically, the shift was monumental. The Meiji government embarked on a campaign of rapid industrialization, building railways, factories, and shipyards with a zeal that would give even the most ambitious startups a run for their money. In 1872, Japan's first railway line opened, stretching 29 kilometers from Tokyo to Yokohama, a symbol of the new era of connectivity and progress. The government also implemented land reforms, ending the feudal system and redistributing land to farmers, laying the groundwork for a capitalist economy that would soon rival those of the West. But modernization wasn't just about shiny new trains and factories, it was about transforming society itself. The class system that had kept samurai, farmers, and merchants in their designated lanes was dismantled, replaced by a meritocratic ethos that valued education and skill over birthright. The samurai, once the warrior elite, found themselves adrift in a world where swords were replaced by suits and ties. Some adapted, becoming bureaucrats, educators, or entrepreneurs, while others clung to the past, their katana now more a relic than a weapon. As Japan modernized, it also began to assert itself on the world stage. The Sino-Japanese War 1894-1895 and the Russo-Japanese War 1904-1905 were not just conflicts over territory, but statements of Japan's newfound power and ambition. The victory over Russia was particularly significant, marking the first time an Asian nation had defeated a European power in modern warfare. It was a clear signal that Japan was no longer a secluded archipelago, but a rising star in the global arena. Yet, even as Japan embraced modernity, the echoes of its feudal past lingered, subtly influencing everything from business practices to pop culture. Take the concept of keiretsu, the tight-knit corporate conglomerates that dominate Japan's economy. These are modern-day equivalents of the feudal domains, with companies interlinked through cross-shareholding and familial ties, reminiscent of the daimyo's networks of vassals and allies. Then there's the enduring fascination with samurai culture immortalized in countless films, anime, and manga. The romantic image of the samurai as noble warriors, guided by the Bushido Code, continues to captivate audiences worldwide, even as history tells a more nuanced tale of political maneuvering and social ambition. It's a testament to the power of myth and the human desire for heroes, even those whose real lives were more complex than the legends they inspired. So, what do we make of this journey from isolation to empire, from rice fields to railroads? The history of Japan's transformation is a reminder that change is both inevitable and complex, driven by a myriad of forces, political, economic, and cultural. It's a story of adaptation and resilience, of a nation that rose to the challenges of a changing world by embracing innovation while honoring its rich heritage. As you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of Japan's past resonate in your mind. Remember that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experience, woven together by the threads of ambition, conflict, and creativity. The saga of Japan's evolution from a feudal society to a modern state is a testament to the enduring power of transformation and the indomitable spirit of a people who dared to dream beyond the shores of their island nation. Sweet dreams, and may the lessons of the past inspire the possibilities of tomorrow. You open your eyes to the chill of a 12th century dawn in Normandy, the kind that makes you grateful for every thread in your woolen tunic. This is no ordinary day. It's another round in the life of a Norman archer. Your trusty longbow leans against the wall, a constant companion that cost you around 10 shillings. Now, don't scoff. That's small beer compared to the price of a warhorse, but still a decent chunk of your earnings. Let's break down the numbers, shall we? A skilled archer like you might earn around 2 pennies a day. In the grand scheme of medieval economics, you're not exactly swimming in coins. But hey, at least you're not a peasant tied to the land, right? Your bow, a marvel of yew and sinew, is a key to mobility and a weapon of mass destruction, or at least mass inconvenience, for your enemies. As you munch on your breakfast of coarse bread and cheese, you mull over the economic realities that shaped your world. Your skills put you in a unique spot in the feudal hierarchy, not quite a noble, but definitely better off than the serfs tilling the fields. You're a freelancer of sorts, selling your prowess to the highest bidder, which often happens to be your local lord. In a world where status is as rigid as a well-strung bow, you're something of an anomaly. Training, of course, didn't come easy. Picture years of practice, honing your aim until you could hit a target from 200 yards away. That's 2 football fields, if you're keeping score with modern eyes. It's a far cry from the romanticized image of archers effortlessly unleashing arrows in perfect arcs. Your fingers bear the calluses of a craftsman, and your shoulders tell tales of long hours spent perfecting your draw. And let's not forget the equipment. You're not just armed with a bow and arrows, there's also the matter of your quiver, your braces, and the ever-important dagger for close encounters. Each piece is a small testament to the craftsmanship of the time, and each has its own price tag. Silver pennies, copper coins, it all adds up. A well-stocked quiver could set you back another couple of shillings, a small fortune for someone in your line of work. Now, you might have heard tales of archers as the rock stars of medieval warfare, but let's ground ourselves in reality. You're not lounging in luxury. In fact, your position is precarious, always at the mercy of the winds of war, the whims of your lord, and the ever-present risk of injury. One misstep in battle, and suddenly that glamorous life of an archer doesn't seem so appealing, does it? You see, the Norman archer was a cornerstone of military strategy, but not the dashing hero of legend. Your skills were critical, yes, but you were also just another cog in the vast medieval war machine. Yet there's something undeniably appealing about the image of the lone archer, standing tall against a backdrop of clashing swords and thundering hooves. It's a myth that persists because it's equal parts romantic and rebellious. As you finish your breakfast and prepare for the day's training, you reflect on the societal factors that put you here. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was a game-changer, and archers were a key element of that success. The Battle of Hastings? Anyone? It's a reminder of your role in history. Small, yes, but significant enough to sway the course of events. You and your fellow archers aren't just soldiers. You're instruments of change in a world that's constantly shifting. The morning sun begins its ascent, casting long shadows over the training field. Today, you'll spend hours practicing with your comrades, refining the art of the volley. It's not just about hitting targets, it's about timing, coordination, and trust in the man beside you. You're part of a symphony of war, where precision and patience are your greatest assets. As you string your bow and prepare for the first shot of the day, you consider what it means to be an archer in this age. You're not just fighting for land or lord, you're fighting for something more ephemeral. Perhaps the chance to carve out a sliver of freedom in a world bound by duty and allegiance. It's a reminder that even in the rigid structure of feudal society, there are still opportunities to redefine your place. And as your arrow flies, you realize that in the grand tapestry of history, you're not just a footnote. You're a living, breathing part of it, with each pull of the string and each arrow released. So here's to another day in the life of a Norman archer, where every sunrise brings a new chance to make your mark. As your arrow cuts through the morning air with a satisfying thwip, let's pivot to the bigger picture, the tangled web of power plays and shifting alliances that mark 12th century France. Spoiler alert, it's more dramatic than a medieval soap opera, and you, my friend, are one of the unsung extras in this epic production. France, during this era, was a patchwork of territories, each ruled by its own local lord or duke, with the King of France, a title that fluctuated in authority like a monarch on a seesaw, trying to keep it all together. Picture a game of chess where every piece has its own agenda. The Normans, having conquered England in 1066, were the heavyweights in the room. They held sway over Normandy and parts of England, making them a force even the French crown had to reckon with. Talk about playing both sides. Now, where does an archer like you fit into this grand chessboard? Think of yourself as a rook, an essential piece, not the star, but crucial in executing strategies. Archers were the medieval equivalent of artillery units, strategically positioned to rain down chaos from a distance. You were the long-distance disruptors, the ones who could change the course of a skirmish before the knights even got their shiny armor dented. Speaking of battles, the Norman archers made quite a splash at the Battle of Hastings. You know, the famous 1066 showdown where William the Conqueror earned his title? Archers played a pivotal role there, softening up the Saxon lines before the cavalry charged in. It wasn't pretty. War rarely is, but effective? Absolutely. The myth of the lone archer hero was born here, but reality check, it was more about coordinated chaos than individual glory. Fast forward to the 12th century, and you'll find the same tactics being honed and refined. The power dynamics between the Normans, the Capetian kings of France, and other ambitious nobles made battles a constant reality. Archers were as indispensable as they were expendable. Not exactly a Hallmark card moment, right? But that's the gritty truth. Your job was to do the dirty work at a distance. In many ways, you were the unsung backbone of medieval warfare, your arrows speaking louder than any battle cry. And let's talk tactics. The key was the volley. Imagine a rainstorm of arrows, blotting out the sun like a scene straight out of a blockbuster. It was psychological warfare at its finest, demoralizing enemy troops before they even caught a glimpse of your side's knightly muscle. But the romance of those arrows darkening the sky? That's Hollywood. The truth was, you spent hours perfecting your aim, standing in muddy fields, hoping the wind didn't decide to play games with your trajectory. Now, the political landscape wasn't just about who had the most knights or the best archers. It was about alliances, betrayals, and marriages that could make or break kingdoms. The Normans, with their Anglo-Norman ties, were constantly in a delicate dance with the French crown. The English Channel wasn't just a body of water, it was a moat filled with tension and opportunity. So while you're perfecting your aim, remember that your arrows are part of a larger strategy, a silent dialogue in the language of warfare. The volley you practice today could be the deciding factor in a battle tomorrow, or simply another day's work in a world that never stops plotting its next move. In the end, you're a cog in a vast machine, but one that's essential to keeping the gears of history turning. As the morning sun climbs higher, you take a moment to absorb it all, the political machinations, the military strategies, the sheer unpredictability of your era. All of it forms the backdrop to your life. It's a reminder that while the legends may focus on kings and knights, the real story is made by those like you, whose lives were both ordinary and extraordinary in their own right. So, here's to another day in the life of a Norman archer, where every arrow is a small but significant piece of the grand, chaotic puzzle that is medieval France. With the midday sun finally granting you a reprieve from the morning's exertion, it's time for a well-earned lunch break. As you sink your teeth into another slab of coarse bread, perhaps with a side of pottage if you're lucky, let's chew over the real place of archers like you in Norman society. Spoiler alert, it's not all about glory and grandeur. Now, if you're picturing yourself as a medieval rock star because of your archery skills, let's pop that bubble right now. The truth is, the life of a Norman archer was less about the spotlight and more about the grind. While you might have been a critical part of the battlefield symphony off the field, you were far from a headliner. In the grand feudal orchestra, you were more like the percussionist essential, but rarely the focus of attention. Economically speaking, you're not exactly rolling in riches. Earning around 2 pennies a day, as we mentioned previously, isn't the stuff of wealth. To put it in perspective, a skilled blacksmith could earn twice that, and a knight, well, let's just say they're not pinching pennies. Your income was just enough to keep you in the game, not to mention in arrows and ale, but certainly not enough to lift you above the rigid social strata. And then there's the matter of living conditions. You're not lounging in a lord's manor, but more likely bunking in a modest dwelling with fellow archers or soldiers. Picture a cramped space with straw bedding and the occasional rodent roommate. Glamorous, right? Yet, compared to the peasants labouring under a feudal lord's thumb, you had a sliver more freedom. You weren't bound to the land, which was a big deal in an era where mobility could mean the difference between a life of toil and a shot at something more. Socially, archers occupied a curious space. You weren't quite peasants, but you certainly weren't knights or nobility. Your skills on the battlefield offered a unique form of leverage, making you a valuable asset in times of war. But in peacetime, your importance dwindled faster than a candle in the wind. The nobles were the ones calling the shots, and you were there to follow orders, like a medieval freelancer whose gigs depended on the latest skirmish or uprising. Yet, there's a seductive allure to the myth of the noble archer. This idea that you were the lone wolf, the rebel with a bow, challenging the status quo. This narrative, fueled by centuries of legend and lore, paints you as a romantic figure. And who doesn't love the image of the untethered warrior, armed with nothing but skill and courage? It's a lovely story, but the reality was more about surviving in a system that valued you only as long as your aim was true. Now let's talk feudal hierarchy, that rigid ladder of medieval life. At the top, you've got the king and his court, then the dukes and counts, followed by the knights who were the muscle of the realm. Archers like you? Somewhere in the middle, a notch above the peasants but leagues below the nobility. You were the middle children of the feudal family. Essential, but often overlooked, unless someone needed an arrow slung in a hurry. Your place in this hierarchy wasn't just about battlefield prowess. It was also shaped by the whims of the economy and the politics of the time. During periods of war, your value soared, and with it, perhaps a little extra coin. But in peace, you were an expendable asset, easily forgotten until the next conflict came knocking. The harsh truth is, you were a tool of war, not a celebrated hero. Your bow might have given you a modicum of independence, but it didn't elevate you to the heights of feudal society. And what about that myth of the lone archer standing valiantly against oppression? While it adds a dash of drama to our story, the reality was that your life was dictated by contracts and service. You were a soldier of fortune, bound by the promises of pay and provisions, rather than a crusader for justice. It's easy to romanticize the past, but the gritty truth is that survival was often the primary motivator, not glory. So here you are, munching away, reflecting on your place in this grand medieval tapestry. You're not a pawn, but neither are you a king. You're one of the countless faces that filled the ranks, making history not through grand gestures, but through the everyday grind. The allure of the archer hero might linger in the annals of legend, but the reality was far more complex, a blend of necessity, skill, and the ever-present uncertainty of the times. As you finish your lunch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the field, you prepare to return to your training. Another day, another volley, another chance to etch your mark in the sands of time, however small. And as you do, remember that while the myths may captivate, it's the real stories like yours that truly define the era. You're a player in this historical drama, and every day brings a new scene in the relentless play that is 12th century Normandy. The afternoon sun is your cue to shift gears, moving from the introspective lull of lunch to the innovations that are the lifeblood of your world. Let's dive into the tech and tactics that made you, the Norman archer, a force to be reckoned with. Spoiler alert, it's not all about the glamour of stringing a bow. First up, let's chat about your trusty companion, the longbow. This isn't just a glorified stick and string. We're talking about a technological marvel of its time, crafted from yew wood, which just so happens to be Mother Nature's gift to archers. Why yew? It's strong and flexible, giving your arrows a powerful launch. The longbow's design wasn't born from a whim, but from necessity, able to propel arrows up to 250 yards. That's 2.5 football fields for those keeping score at home. Now, if you think pulling back on a longbow is a breeze, think again. With a draw weight of around 100 pounds, it's less like playing at the archery range and more akin to a medieval CrossFit session. Your shoulders are the unsung heroes here, bearing the burden of your weapon's might. But this muscle-building marvel wasn't just about brute strength. Oh no, the longbow was a game-changer on the battlefield, allowing you to strike from a distance while keeping your boots dry and your head attached. Talk about a strategic advantage. Here's where the rubber, or should I say, the sinew meets the road. The longbow was a double-edged sword, or rather a double-strung bow. On the one hand, it gave you the ability to engage enemies from afar, a key factor in battles like Agincourt, where archers rained arrows on knights like medieval drone strikes. On the other hand, it meant that your enemies were evolving too, developing better armor and tactics to counteract your long-range poking. Innovation breeds innovation, after all. You had to stay sharp, or risk becoming obsolete faster than last year's lance. Let's not forget the arrows themselves. These weren't just pointy sticks, they were precision-engineered projectiles. Each arrow had a bodkin point, designed to pierce armor like a hot knife through butter. And while we're talking tech, consider the fletchings, those feathers at the back. Goose feathers were the go-to, adding stability to your flight path, ensuring your arrows didn't veer off like a drunk knight at a jousting match. But in the backdrop of this tech symphony, there's the constant hum of economics. Producing a longbow was no cheap affair, and kidding yourself with a full quiver of arrows, that could set you back a small fortune, at least half a shilling per arrow. When you're earning just a couple of pennies a day, that's a cost you feel in your purse and your morale. The reality here is that innovation often comes at a price, one that's paid in both coin and commitment. Now, while you're out there perfecting your craft, there's a whirlwind of cultural shifts spinning around you. The 12th century was a hotbed of change, not just on the battlefield but in society at large. The rise of towns and the shift towards a more cash-based economy meant that your role as a military freelancer was evolving. You were no longer just a cog in the feudal machine, but part of a broader economic tapestry where services like yours were increasingly in demand. The rise of mercenaries, the precursor to modern military contractors, was on the horizon, and your skills were at the forefront of this shift. But let's burst another bubble of romanticism, shall we? The notion of archers being the lone wolves of warfare, noble, misunderstood, standing apart from the sweaty mass of infantry, is a narrative that's more Hollywood than history. In reality, you were often part of a larger team, a unit that moved and fired as one. Precision, coordination, and a dash of luck were your allies. The volley was your bread and butter, a coordinated effort to turn the tide of battle before the swords began their bloody dance. As you train, you're not just honing your aim, you're part of a larger experiment in military strategy. The innovations in tactics were as critical as those in technology. The rise of formations like the schiltron, a dense circle of archers and spearmen, was designed to fend off cavalry charges and hold ground. This wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about survival in an era where battles were brutal and the line between victory and defeat was as thin as a bowstring. And let's talk about how these changes shaped your life. Your skills, honed through years of blistered fingers and sore shoulders, became your ticket to a life that, while not luxurious, offered a sliver of independence. You weren't tied to a plough or a lord's whims, but your fate was still closely linked to the tides of war. Peace might mean less work, but it also meant less income. A precarious balancing act in a world where stability was as elusive as a well-aimed arrow in a gust of wind. So, here you are, an archer in 12th century France, standing at the crossroads of innovation and tradition. Your life is a testament to the ever-shifting dynamics of your era. A world where technology, economy, and warfare are inextricably linked. You're a part of this evolving story, each arrow a chapter in the grand narrative of history. As the afternoon sun begins its descent, casting long shadows over the training field, you prepare for another round of practice, another opportunity to leave your mark in the annals of time. Your journey is far from over, and the path ahead is as unpredictable as the winds that guide your arrows. As the sun dips toward the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, it's time to draw the curtain on another day in the life of a Norman archer. The day's exertions have left your muscles sore, and your mind teeters between exhaustion and reflection. Let's take a moment to ponder the legacy of archers like you, those unsung heroes of medieval warfare whose reality often gets lost amidst the romance of legend. First off, let's tackle the myth head-on. The image of the lone archer, valiantly standing against a tide of armoured foes, is an intoxicating one. It's got all the trappings of a great story: bravery, skill, defiance against the odds. But let's not kid ourselves. This isn't a blockbuster movie. In reality, archers were rarely solo heroes. You were part of a team, firing in volleys, your arrows creating a deadly rain that could turn the tide of battle. Individual heroics were less common than coordinated chaos. Why does this myth persist then? Because it's a tale as old as time, the individual triumphing against insurmountable odds. It's the same reason we love underdog stories today. But your life as a Norman archer was far more about endurance and skill than about glory. You were a vital cog in the war machine, yes, but one that could be replaced if the gears stopped turning smoothly. Now, let's talk about the economics of it all, because every legend has a price tag. Arming and training a force of archers was a significant investment. A good longbow cost around 10 shillings, not to mention the arrows, which could set you back half a shilling each. In an age where a penny a day was a common wage, these costs were substantial. The investment was worth it, though, because archers could halt a cavalry charge with a well-timed volley, saving on the much more expensive necessity of armoured knights. The economic context shaped your world in more ways than one. Warfare in the medieval period was as much about the purse as the sword. Armies were expensive, and the ability of archers to inflict damage from a distance made them a cost-effective force multiplier. Your skill was a currency in its own right, a testament to the shifting sands of military strategy where brains often triumphed over brawn. But let's not ignore the cultural impact. Archers have been romanticized in literature and film, from the ballads of Robin Hood to the blockbuster portrayals of medieval battles. This romanticization is appealing. Who doesn't love a rebel with a bow fighting for justice against tyranny? Yet, the truth is more nuanced. Robin Hood may have been a master archer in legend, but the real-life archers were more likely to be fighting for survival than for noble causes. This myth-making isn't just a modern phenomenon. Medieval chroniclers were no stranger to embellishment, painting battles with strokes of valor and heroism. The reality? War was grim and brutal, a test of endurance as much as skill. Archers like you were the unsung heroes, the ones who rarely got their names in the history books, yet whose impact was undeniable. Speaking of impact, let's not forget the lasting legacy of the Norman archers. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, where archers played a pivotal role, reshaped the political landscape of Europe. The tactics honed in this period influenced centuries of military strategy, proving that a well-placed arrow could be as decisive as a cavalry charge. The longbow, that marvel of medieval engineering, became a symbol of English military prowess, its legacy echoing through battles like Agincourt. But beyond the battlefield, the role of archers helped shift the societal structure. As warfare evolved, so did the social fabric. The rise of professional soldiers, including archers, was a step toward a more structured military system, moving away from the feudal levies that characterized earlier medieval armies. You were part of this transformation, a contributor to a more professional, organized approach to warfare. As you contemplate these legacies, remember that the tale of the archer is one of both evolution and enduring relevance. The myths may paint you as a solitary hero, but the reality of your role was one of collective effort and strategic innovation. Your arrows didn't just fly through the air, they helped chart the course of history, one volley at a time. So here's to you, the Norman archer, standing at the crossroads of myth and reality. As the evening shadows lengthen, casting a serene blanket over the landscape, You're reminded that while legends may fade, the impact of your craft endures. You were an integral part of a transformative era, a witness to the complex tapestry of 12th century life. In the grand scheme of history, your legacy is both humble and profound, a testament to the power of skill, strategy, and the indomitable human spirit. As you lay down your bow for the night, the echoes of your life continue to resonate through the ages, a reminder that while myths may entertain, it's the real stories that truly shape our world. In the cacophony of medieval politics, where loyalty was as stable as a juggler on a tightrope, a certain young lad named Richard was busy cutting his teeth. Born in 1157, Richard Plantagenet, who would one day earn the moniker Lionheart, didn't exactly emerge into a world of lullabies and bedtime stories. His cradle was rocked by the relentless ambition of his father, King Henry II of England, and the fierce political manoeuvres of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Talk about a family that put the fun in dysfunctional. Richard was the third son, often considered the spare in a world where heirs were the real MVPs. But don't let that fool you into thinking he was just another medieval wallflower. Even as a teenager, Richard was a rebellious spirit, a bit like a 12th century rock star minus the guitar, but with plenty of swordplay. His father, Henry II, was a formidable ruler, but his parenting style could best be described as tough love. Heavy on the tough, light on the love. Henry's idea of bonding time involved teaching his sons the fine art of territorial squabbling and, occasionally, outright rebellion. Now, Richard wasn't just rebelling for fun, he had a knack for warfare that was almost uncanny. Picture this. By the tender age of 16, he had already led his first military campaign in the region of Aquitaine. That's right. While today's teenagers might be busy navigating high school cliques, Richard was commanding troops and engaging in the not-so-subtle art of medieval conquest. The Aquitaine region, part of his mother's inheritance, was a hotbed of unrest, and young Richard was tasked with bringing it to heel. It wasn't just a playground scuffle, this was about power, land, and a hefty dose of family drama. The romanticized image of Richard as a chivalrous knight in shining armor is a bit misleading. Sure, he had the armor and the flair for dramatic entrances, but chivalry, in the medieval sense, was more about warfare than wooing damsels. His first forays into battle were less about noble quests and more about consolidating power and asserting dominance. Richard wasn't reading love sonnets. He was reading the battlefield like a chessboard, each move calculated to checkmate his opponents. The young lion was also known for his fiery temperament. In 1173, not content with merely being a pawn in his father's grand design, Richard joined his brothers in a rebellion against Henry II. This was no small family spat. It was a full-scale revolt involving multiple territories and a coalition of disgruntled nobles. Talk about sibling rivalry with a medieval twist. The rebellion stretched across territories, rattling the foundations of Henry's empire and proving that Richard had no qualms about biting the hand that fed him, if that hand happened to belong to his father. The rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful, was a formative experience for Richard. It taught him valuable lessons in strategy and the importance of alliances. It also solidified his reputation as a formidable military leader. By the time the dust settled, Richard had earned grudging respect from both allies and adversaries. His ability to inspire loyalty among his men and his flair for daring tactics made him a force to be reckoned with. But let's not romanticize this too much. His leadership was as much about ruthless efficiency as it was about charisma. Now, let's talk numbers. By the late 1170s, Richard was firmly in control of Aquitaine. His campaigns were not just about flexing military muscles, they were also costly affairs. Maintaining an army required serious cash flow, and Richard wasn't known for being thrifty. In a world where a single suit of armor could cost the equivalent of a small fortune, Richard's taste for war was an expensive habit. Yet his ability to fund these ventures was a testament to his skills in governance and his mother's savvy political maneuvering. Richard's early years were a whirlwind of battles, betrayals, and a healthy dose of sibling rivalry. In a family where alliances were as fragile as the peace treaties they signed, Richard stood out as both a product of his environment and a master of its games. He was a lion in a den of vipers, learning to roar louder and fight harder than any of his contemporaries. But beneath the bravado, his formative years reveal a young man shaped by the harsh realities of medieval politics, where the line between hero and villain was as thin as a sword's edge. So, while the legends might paint him as a valiant knight, the truth is that Richard the Lionheart was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it. As the dust of Richard's early exploits settled, our young lion was already eyeing the English throne with the kind of ambition that could make a modern-day corporate ladder climber look like a sloth. In 1189, the cards fell in his favour, with his father, Henry II, out of the picture thanks to a combination of betrayal and, shall we say, family networking. Richard Plantagenet ascended to the English throne. But, before you could even say, "Hail to the King," Richard had other grand ideas. Forget cozying up in the royal comforts of England, he had his sights set on a grander stage, the Third Crusade. Because why rule one kingdom when you could gallivant across continents in a bid to reclaim the Holy Land? Richard wasn't exactly a homebody, more of a medieval jet-setter, if you will. And so, almost as soon as the crown was perched on his head, he departed for the Crusades. He left the kingdom in the hands of regents, his mother Eleanor and the loyal but slightly overwhelmed William Longchamp, the Bishop of Ely. It's like leaving your car keys with the neighbour kid while you go on a year-long road trip. What could possibly go wrong? Now, let's talk about the economic impact of Richard's wanderlust. Ruling a kingdom isn't cheap, and neither is crusading. Richard needed to finance his grand adventure, and he did it the old-fashioned way, by taxing the heck out of his subjects. Enter the infamous Saladin tithe. This was a special tax levied in 1188 to fund the crusade, named after Richard's formidable opponent, the Muslim leader Saladin. The tithe demanded a tenth of every man's income and movable goods. Peasants, clergy, nobility. No one was safe from the grasp of Richard's fundraising efforts. It's almost like a medieval Kickstarter campaign, only with fewer perks and more compulsion. The operating costs of a crusade were astronomical. Picture this. Equipping a single knight cost as much as a small village's annual income. Horses, armour, weapons, food supplies, and the inevitable bribes to ensure safe passage through less than friendly territories. All of these added up faster than you can say holy war. Richard's crusade wasn't just a spiritual quest, it was a logistical nightmare and a financial sinkhole. Despite the economic strain, Richard's charisma was such that he managed to scrape together a formidable force. He was like the medieval version of a rock star on a world tour, rallying knights and soldiers to his cause with promises of glory and divine favour. But here's the kicker. Richard was rarely in England to manage the kingdom he was supposed to be ruling. His so-called commanding presence was more of an absentee landlord situation. It's a bit like being the CEO of a company you never visit and expecting it to thrive on autopilot. Back home, England was left to muddle through without its king. The regents were juggling political tensions, rebellious nobles, and the disgruntled populace who were less than thrilled about the heavy taxation. Richard's absence stirred the pot of unrest, and the kingdom simmered with the kind of tension that makes Game of Thrones look like a tea party. And let's not forget the ransom fiasco. During his return journey from the Crusades, Richard was captured and held for ransom by Duke Leopold of Austria. This wasn't some small-time ransom either. The price for Richard's release was a staggering 150,000 marks, equivalent to 2 or 3 years' revenue for the English crown. To put it in modern terms, it was like asking for the GDP of a small nation in exchange for one person. The English people were squeezed for every penny to secure their king's release. Talk about being a high-maintenance monarch. Yet, despite all this, the tales of Richard's bravery and military prowess on the crusade spread far and wide. He became a legend, a figure of mythic proportions, hailed as a hero of Christendom. His exploits were romanticized in songs and stories, painting him as the quintessential knight-errant. The reality, however, was far grittier. The Crusades were brutal, and Richard was as much a warrior as he was a strategist, negotiating truces and forging alliances with as much skill as he wielded a sword. The duality of Richard's legacy is fascinating. He was a king who spent only about 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, yet he is remembered as one of the greatest English monarchs. His absence was keenly felt, yet his legend only grew in his absence. It's a paradox wrapped in chainmail. A king who conquered lands, led armies, and inspired legends, but hardly ever set foot in the kingdom he ruled. As we delve further into Richard's reign, we'll explore how this lion-hearted king continued to shape his legacy from afar, leaving his mark on both history and myth. But for now, let's just say that Richard's reign was a masterclass in the art of being everywhere and nowhere all at once. As Richard the Lionheart's legend galloped across Europe, he was busy embroiled in the gritty business of the Third Crusade, a saga as messy as a medieval banquet. Our tale dives right into the Siege of Acre, a strategic gem in Richard's crown of military exploits. Acre was the Crusaders' gateway to the Holy Land, a port city crammed with enough tension to rival a modern-day soap opera. But first things first, Richard's arrival. Picture a scene worthy of a blockbuster entrance. While Philip II of France had already set foot in the Holy Land, it wasn't until June 1191 that Richard showed up, fashionably late but with considerable fanfare. He arrived with a fleet that made the Mediterranean sparkle, bringing an impressive entourage of knights and soldiers, each more eager than the last to test their mettle against Saladin's forces. His arrival was the medieval equivalent of a rock star rolling onto the stage, complete with the roar of armour and the glint of freshly polished swords. Now, let's talk numbers. Richard's forces were a formidable assembly of around 17,000 troops, a testament to his knack for rallying support and squeezing every last penny from his subjects. Philip II of France, on the other hand, had about 6,000 troops, a respectable number but a fraction of Richard's might. The tension between these two monarchs was palpable, a rivalry that could have been lifted straight from a tabloid headline, Richard versus Philip, a battle of egos. This wasn't their first rodeo. Both kings had history, not least due to territorial disputes back in Europe. But here in Acre, personal grudges were overshadowed by a common goal, wresting control from Saladin. The siege itself was a drawn-out affair, having dragged on since 1189, and the Crusaders were desperate for a breakthrough. Richard's strategic genius shone through in his ability to coordinate attacks, supply his troops, and bolster morale, all while keeping an eye on Philip's every move. The Siege of Acre wasn't just a military operation, it was a logistical nightmare. Feeding an army of thousands required a supply chain that would give today's logisticians a run for their money. The cost of maintaining such a force was astronomical, and Richard's coffers felt the strain. Yet, despite the odds, victory came on July 12, 1191, when the city finally capitulated. It was a hard-won victory, and while both kings basked in the glory, tensions simmered just below the surface. Enter the myth of a unified Christian front. Sure, the Crusaders were united against a common enemy, but the reality was as fragmented as a shattered mosaic. Richard and Philip's alliance was more of a fragile truce than a brotherly partnership. The two kings were like oil and water, coexisting but never truly mixing. Their rivalry was as much about personal prestige as it was about religious fervour. Philip, perhaps sensing that the limelight was slipping from his grasp, decided to pack his bags and head back to France shortly after Acre fell. His departure left Richard as the uncontested leader, a role he relished with every fibre of his being. Meanwhile, Saladin was no slouch in the art of war himself. The legendary Muslim leader was a master tactician, revered by his followers and respected by his enemies. His forces were formidable, and while Acre was a setback, Saladin's resolve remained unshaken. Richard knew that to secure the Holy Land, he'd have to face Saladin on the battlefield, a prospect that stirred his warrior's heart. The Battle of Arsuf, on September 7, 1191, was Richard's moment to shine. It was a textbook display of military prowess, a clash of titans that saw Richard pitted against Saladin's forces in a brutal contest of strategy and strength. Richard's army, numbering around 12,000, clashed with Saladin's, estimated at 20,000 to 30,000 strong. Despite being outnumbered, Richard's tactical acumen turned the tide. His use of heavy cavalry charges, those famous knights in shining armour, cut through Saladin's lines like a hot knife through butter. It was a victory that bolstered the morale of the Christian forces and cemented Richard's reputation as a military genius. But let's not get too carried away by the romanticism of knightly valour. The reality was that the Crusades were a bloody affair, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The battlefields were a far cry from the chivalric tales of noble knights and gallant deeds. Richard's grandstanding was matched by the grim reality of war, a dichotomy that underscored the harsh truths of medieval combat. The victory at Arsuf was significant, but it didn't bring an end to the crusade. The road to Jerusalem was still fraught with peril, and Richard's diplomatic skills were soon put to the test. The negotiations with Saladin were as intricate as a chess game, with each side manoeuvring for advantage. Richard, ever the pragmatist, recognized that a military victory wasn't the only path to success. The two leaders exchanged gifts and envoys, each respecting the other's prowess, even as they remained locked in opposition. The diplomacy between Richard and Saladin revealed a mutual respect that transcended the battlefield. It was a relationship characterized by both tension and admiration, a testament to the complexity of human interactions in the midst of war. Despite their enmity, there was an underlying acknowledgement of each other's honor and skill, a nuance often lost in the romanticized retellings of the Crusades. As the crusade continued, the myth of a unified Christian campaign was further debunked by the reality of constant infighting. Richard's leadership was challenged not only by external foes, but also by internal dissent. The Crusaders were a motley crew, a coalition of factions with their own agendas and rivalries. Richard's penchant for grandstanding, while effective in rallying troops, sometimes rubbed his allies the wrong way. The politics of the crusade were as treacherous as any battlefield, and Richard navigated them with a blend of charisma and cunning. Yet, for all his flaws, Richard's charisma was undeniable. His presence inspired loyalty and courage, qualities that were essential for the grueling campaign ahead. The road to Jerusalem was still open, and Richard's determination was as fierce as ever. His story was far from over, with more battles, negotiations, and legendary exploits on the horizon. So, as Richard continued his crusade, the legend of the Lionheart grew, even as the reality of his reign was marked by absence and ambition. The duality of his legacy hero and absentee king, warrior, and diplomat offers a complex portrait of a man who lived for the thrill of conquest and the allure of eternal glory. But the Holy Land was still a contested prize, and Richard's journey was only at its midpoint. The stage was set for further drama, with the stakes as high as the ambitions of the men who fought for control of the sacred soil. As Richard's crusading saga unfolded, the road ahead was paved with the kind of challenges that could make even the most seasoned adventurer reconsider his travel plans. Yet it wasn't the heat of the Holy Land or the clash with Saladin that would mark the next chapter of Richard's escapades. No, the real twist in this medieval epic occurred on his journey home, because apparently being a legendary king wasn't enough to guarantee safe passage through Europe. Picture this. It's December 1192, and Richard, fresh from the battlefield, is making his way back to England. His travelling itinerary? Less of a direct flight and more of a zigzagging escape room. The route back was fraught with political landmines, and Richard, ever the gambler, decided to cross through the lands of his not-so-friendly neighbour, Duke Leopold of Austria. Now, Leopold wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. After all, Richard had previously insulted him at Acre by tossing the Duke's banner off the city walls. Not the kind of faux pas that leads to a peaceful coexistence. Enter Act 1 of our medieval drama, The Capture. Richard's attempt at incognito travel was about as successful as a celebrity in sunglasses at a paparazzi convention. He was recognized, captured, and essentially became the most high-profile hostage of the 12th century. You see, Duke Leopold had a bone to pick and saw a golden opportunity, quite literally, to settle scores. Richard was handed over to Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who promptly set the ransom at a jaw-dropping 150,000 marks. To give you a sense of scale, that was roughly 2 to 3 years' worth of England's GDP. It's like asking for the entire national budget in exchange for a single person. Talk about inflation. Back in England, news of Richard's capture spread faster than a medieval gossip chain. The economic strain of this ransom was no joke. The kingdom was practically turned upside down, and it fell to Richard's formidable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, to rally the troops, figuratively and financially. Eleanor was no stranger to the political chessboard. She was a player who knew how to outmaneuver her opponents and extract every ounce of loyalty and coin from her subjects. Raising the ransom was a Herculean task. Enter the Richard tax, a very special kind of fundraising campaign that would put GoFundMe to shame. The people of England were taxed to their breaking point. The clergy contributed gold, the nobles dug deep into their coffers, and even the common folk were squeezed for whatever they could spare. Church plate was melted down, and every ounce of available silver was gathered to free their king. It was a national effort of epic proportions, a testament to both the loyalty Richard inspired and the desperation of a kingdom missing its monarch. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the unity of the English people. The reality was that many grumbled under the weight of this financial burden, and the political scene was rife with intrigue. Richard's brother, Prince John, ever the schemer, saw his siblings' captivity as a golden opportunity to bolster his own power. History would later paint John as a villain, a reputation that would earn him infamy in the tales of Robin Hood. But at this moment, he was a man playing a dangerous game of thrones. The ransom negotiations were less of a straightforward transaction and more of a drawn-out diplomatic dance. Eleanor negotiated tirelessly, employing every diplomatic trick in the book to ensure her son's release. Her efforts were a masterclass in medieval politics, showcasing her ability to charm and cajole with the best of them. The whole affair highlighted the irony of the Lionheart being caged, his freedom hinging on the very political machinations he often sought to avoid. By February 1194, the ransom was finally paid and Richard was released. His return to England was met with a mix of relief and frustration. The people had bled their coffers dry for their king, and though his presence was a balm to many, the economic scars remained. The saga of Richard's capture and ransom was a stark reminder of the unpredictability of medieval politics, a world where even the mightiest could be brought low by the whims of fortune. Richard's captivity and the resulting financial turmoil left an indelible mark on the nation. The irony of it all was that while Richard was celebrated as a hero, his absence had left England in a state of chaos. His return was not the end of the story, but rather a continuation of a reign that was as tumultuous as it was legendary. The Lionheart was back, but the challenges he faced were far from over. As he reclaimed his throne and sought to stabilize his realm, the legacy of his capture loomed large, its echoes felt in every corner of his kingdom. The stage was set for the next act in Richard's extraordinary life, a tale of power, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of glory. As Richard settled back into the not-so-comfy seat of the English throne in March 1194, the kingdom was still reeling from the economic hangover of his ransom. You'd think his first move might have been to pop into the treasury for a quick audit, but Richard wasn't one to sit around counting coins. Instead, he was off to France faster than you can say continental ambitions. England, it seemed, was more of a pit stop on his grand European tour than a permanent residence. Richard's return to France was driven by a singular obsession, reclaiming the Angevin territories that had slipped into the clutches of King Philip II of France during his absence. It was a classic tale of territorial tug-of-war, complete with shifting alliances and opportunistic nobles. Richard's campaigns in France were a whirlwind of battles and skirmishes, each more dramatic than the last. The king was back in his element, sword in hand, rallying troops and plotting strategies with the zeal of a man who'd spent too long in a cell. In this high-stakes game of geopolitics, Richard's charisma was his ace in the hole. His ability to inspire loyalty among his vassals was legendary. However, loyalty wasn't cheap, and maintaining an army required a constant flow of funds. The English treasury had barely recovered from the ransom debacle, and Richard's military campaigns continued to drain resources faster than a leaky bucket. The cost of waging war was astronomical, with estimates suggesting that Richard spent around £14,000 annually, an eye-watering sum in medieval terms. But for all his military prowess, Richard's true adversary was time. The clock was ticking, and his health was a silent enemy lurking in the shadows. In March 1199, during a routine inspection of his troops at the castle of Château-Chabrol in Limousin, Richard met his match in the form of a crossbow bolt. The wound was minor by today's standards, a simple graze on the shoulder, but infection set in, an all-too-common fate in an era where antibiotics were as fantastical as dragons. As the infection spread, Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly. On April 6, 1199, the Lionheart roared his last. His death was as sudden as it was anticlimactic, a stark reminder that even the mightiest can fall to the smallest of adversaries. Richard's final days were marked by a surprising display of forgiveness. The crossbowman responsible for his wound was pardoned by the dying king, a gesture that contrasts sharply with his otherwise ruthless reputation. So, what do we make of Richard the Lionheart, a king whose heart was as divided as his territories? He was a monarch who spent more time in armour than in court, a ruler whose legacy was as much about what he didn't do as what he did. Richard's reign saw a kingdom ruled in absentia, a nation that bore the financial burdens of his ambitions while rarely seeing the face of their sovereign. The romantic image of Richard as the quintessential knight-errant, dashing through the pages of history, is seductive. It's the stuff of legends, of troubadours and tales spun at firesides. Yet, the reality was far grittier. Richard was a king who left his kingdom to fend for itself while he sought glory on distant shores. His absentee rule left England in the hands of regents, a kingdom managed more by proxy than by presence. Economically, Richard's reign was a mixed bag. The financial strain of his crusades and ransoms left a legacy of debt and economic hardship. The heavy taxation required to fund his exploits was felt keenly by his subjects, a burden that lingered long after his death. Politically, his constant absence created a power vacuum that his brother John would later fill, a decision that history would judge rather harshly. And yet, the myth of the Lionheart endures. Perhaps it's the allure of a larger-than-life figure, a king who lived and died by the sword, whose charisma and courage captured the imagination of generations. The romanticized tales of Richard's bravery and chivalry have a certain appeal, offering a narrative of heroism that glosses over the more mundane realities of his rule. In the end, Richard's legacy is a tapestry of contradictions, a king remembered as much for his absence as for his feats. He was a man of his time, a product of an era where warfare was both a profession and a pastime. The Lionheart story is a reminder that history is seldom black and white. It's a rich, complex palette of triumphs and tragedies, of myths and realities. And as we close the chapter on Richard's saga, we're left with the enduring question, was he a hero of legend or a king who simply roared too loudly? The answer, like so much of history, depends on where you choose to look. Frederick Douglass entered the world in 1808 on a Maryland plantation, where the idea of freedom was about as likely as a snowstorm in July. Picture a world where your future is decided before you can even say your own name, and that's where young Frederick found himself. His early years were spent in the kind of conditions that make the word bleak seem like an understatement. As a child, Douglass would have seen more hardship before breakfast than most folks see in a lifetime. Now, Frederick wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, more like a wooden one if he was lucky. Raised by his grandmother until the age of 7, he was then sent to work for the old family in Baltimore. This change in scenery was Frederick's first glimpse into the world beyond plantation life. Baltimore wasn't exactly a metropolis, but compared to the plantation, it might as well have been Manhattan. Here, Douglass was introduced to the alphabet by Sophia Auld, who was initially unaware that teaching a slave to read was a big no-no. Once her husband put a stop to it, Frederick realized the power of knowledge, and that it was a power the slaveholders feared more than a cat fears a cucumber. So, armed with the forbidden fruit of literacy and a growing sense of self-worth, Douglass spent his teen years in a tug-of-war between despair and determination. He taught himself to read and write in secret, trading bread with local boys for their precious knowledge. Who knew that a few slices of bread could buy you the keys to a mental liberation? Fast forward to 1838, and Frederick's life takes a turn into full-on thriller territory. At 20 years old, Douglass decided it was time to turn the page on his life story and wrote his own escape plan. The mission was clear but far from simple. Get from the clutches of slavery in Maryland to the freedom of the North. The stakes? Everything. Frederick had to navigate a landscape where even the trees seemed to have eyes, and every shadow could be a lurking threat. It was a time when the Underground Railroad wasn't a literal railroad, but a series of safe houses and secret routes. Douglass knew that blending in was key, so he donned the 19th century equivalent of a superhero costume, a sailor's uniform. You see, back then, sailors had a bit more freedom of movement, kind of like the VIPs of the travel world. To complete his disguise, he borrowed a friend's seaman's protection certificate, a document that served as a passport for free black sailors. It was like trying to get through airport security with a library card and hoping nobody notices. With his heart pounding like a jackhammer, Frederick boarded a train to Havre de Grace, Maryland. The distance to Philadelphia, his first stop, was around 60 miles, but it might as well have been a million with the risk he was taking. Every mile was fraught with the danger of discovery, and every conductor was a potential nemesis. The train ride was less Orient Express, more express anxiety. Douglas had to keep his cool and his story straight, knowing that one slip-up could mean a swift return to a life of chains. Once he reached Philadelphia, Douglas was still not in the clear. The city was a brief and nerve-wracking pit stop on his journey to New York City, a city that promised freedom but also held the risk of slave catchers lurking around every corner. The final leg of his escape was a steamboat ride to New York, where he finally breathed the air of freedom on September 3, 1838. It had taken him less than 24 hours to travel those 200 miles, but the journey had been a lifetime in the making. Frederick Douglass's escape wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a middle finger to the oppressive system that sought to keep him and countless others in bondage. His journey from bondage to freedom was a testament to his intelligence, courage, and sheer force of will. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with Douglas playing the role of the mouse who finally outsmarted the cat. He wasn't just running from something, he was running toward a future where he could control his own narrative, and he was just getting started. So, there he was, Frederick Douglass, standing on the precipice of a new life with the intoxicating scent of freedom in his nostrils and a head full of dreams. Fast forward a couple of years, and Douglass had morphed from a fugitive with a sailor's disguise to a powerhouse public speaker, shaking the very foundations of the abolitionist movement. By the 1840s, he was doing more than just sharing his story, he was flipping the script on what it meant to be a former slave in America. Now, here's the kicker. Douglass didn't just stroll into a room, speak a few sentences, and have everyone clapping like they'd just witnessed a Broadway show. Nope. He often faced audiences who were more skeptical than a cat eyeing a new piece of furniture. You see, many folks just couldn't wrap their heads around the notion that a man who had once been enslaved could speak with such eloquence and power. It was as if they'd expected him to stutter through his speeches like a nervous schoolboy at his first debate. One of Douglas's most famous speeches was at Nantucket in August 1841. Picture this. A young Douglas, barely 3 years into his freedom, standing before a crowd at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society convention. His words, fireworks. He spoke with such passion and clarity that the crowd was left both stunned and thrilled. William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent abolitionist who was in attendance, was so impressed that he invited Douglass to become a full-time speaker for the society. Douglass wasn't just a good speaker, he was a linguistic tornado, sweeping away preconceived notions with every syllable. Of course, Douglass faced his share of hecklers and doubters. One of his favourite tactics was to disarm them with wit. When someone in the audience questioned his authenticity, suspecting he was too articulate to have been a slave, Douglass famously quipped, "I appear before you this evening as a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and ran off with them." Bam! Not only did he shut down the criticism, but he also reminded everyone of the brutal reality of slavery, that he had to steal his own personhood just to stand there free and speaking. Now, let's tackle the old chestnut of the self-made man myth. While Frederick Douglass was an epitome of self-determination, he wasn't a lone ranger carving his path with just grit and gumption. He had a support network as crucial as the strings on a marionette. Abolitionist networks, including the likes of Garrison, provided platforms and resources. These folks were the unsung heroes behind the scenes, offering everything from safe lodging to speaking invitations. Douglass was undeniably brilliant, but even a star needs a clear sky to shine. Douglass's rise also happened against a backdrop of economic and social turbulence. The 1840s were a time when the American economy was as unpredictable as a soap opera plot twist. The country was grappling with the fallout of the Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that made life harder for everyone, especially those trying to make their way up from the bottom. Yet, Douglass navigated this landscape with the deftness of a tightrope walker. His speeches didn't just touch on the moral bankruptcy of slavery, they also highlighted the economic arguments, pointing out how slavery was not just a moral blight, but an economic albatross around the nation's neck. Let's not forget the political climate either. The 1840s were a hotbed of debate about slavery, with tempers flaring hotter than a summer barbecue. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was still in effect, meaning that even in the North, Douglass's freedom was a tenuous thing, liable to be snatched away by the long arm of a slave catcher. This constant threat added an edge to his speeches, a reminder that the fight for abolition wasn't just about changing minds, It was a battle for survival. Douglas was more than just a speaker, he was a strategist. He knew that, to change the game, he had to play it smarter than anyone else. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845, was a masterstroke. It sold over 30,000 copies in its first 5 years, a publishing phenomenon in its day. The book wasn't just a recounting of his life, it was a weapon in the abolitionist arsenal, a first-person account that humanized the enslaved and put a face to the suffering. It turned doubters into believers and complacency into action. But Douglas wasn't just content with preaching to the choir. He took his message across the Atlantic to Britain and Ireland in 1845, where he found audiences more receptive or perhaps just more scandalized by American slavery. Over 19 months, Douglas delivered more than 100 lectures, making waves and friends in high places. His British tour was a strategic move that not only spread his message, but also raised enough money for him to buy his legal freedom from his former owner. How's that for turning the tables? And let's spare a moment to ponder the irony here, Douglas. A man who had to escape slavery now had to purchase his freedom. It was a transaction more absurd than buying water in a flood, yet it was necessary for him to return to the United States without the constant fear of re-enslavement. This move, funded by British sympathizers, was a clear indicator that even the most self-reliant individuals often need a helping hand or a checkbook in their quest for freedom. So, in the 1840s, Frederick Douglass wasn't just fighting for abolition. He was redefining what it meant to be an American, crafting a narrative that would inspire generations. He was living proof that the pen, or in his case, the spoken word, was mightier than the chains that once bound him. Douglass was not just a product of his time, but an architect of it, laying the foundation for a future where equality wasn't just an ideal, but a tangible reality. And yet, as the 1850s loomed on the horizon, the fight was far from over. The nation was a tinderbox, and Douglass was just getting started on his mission to light a fire for freedom. Despite the fireworks of the 1840s, Frederick Douglass wasn't just going to ride off into the sunset with a quill in one hand and a speech in the other. No, the 1850s were barreling in like a freight train, and Douglass was preparing to jump on board with his sights set on the levers of power. It was time for him to dive headfirst into the political fray, a realm as murky as it was treacherous. And speaking of treacherous, enter Abraham Lincoln, the man with arguably the most famous stovepipe hat in history. Let's set the stage. The United States in the 1850s was like a dysfunctional family reunion where everyone's got an opinion and nobody's afraid to yell about it. The country was on the brink, teetering between unity and civil war, with the question of slavery as the elephant in every room. Douglass knew that if he wanted to make real change, he needed a seat at the table, or at least a chance to bend the ear of the man at the head of it. The path to Lincoln wasn't paved with roses. Douglass had to navigate a political landscape more complex than a soap opera family tree. The Whigs, the Democrats, the Republicans, each party had its own agenda, often changing positions faster than a weather vane in a hurricane. Douglass, however, was drawn to the burgeoning Republican Party. It was here that he saw the potential for a real push against the institution that had defined and nearly destroyed his life. Fast forward to the early 1860s, and Douglass was finally on Lincoln's radar. Their first meeting, in August 1863, was a mix of the awkward and the momentous, like a first date where both parties are aware they're being set up for destiny. Lincoln, towering and somewhat aloof, presented a sharp contrast to Douglass, who was all intensity and eloquence. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Douglass was there to advocate for the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln had issued back in January. But Douglass wanted more. He was pressing for the full inclusion of African Americans in the Union Army and, critically, equal pay for those who served. Now, let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't the magic wand that many folks today imagine it to be. Sure, it declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be set free, but it didn't touch those in the border states still loyal to the Union. It was more a strategic move than a pure act of moral conviction. Lincoln himself said that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do it. Awkward, right? But this was a chess game, and the Emancipation Proclamation was a key piece on the board, aiming to weaken the Confederacy's war effort and keep European powers out of the conflict. Douglas, with his usual candor, wasn't afraid to call out the half measures. He urged Lincoln to go further, to ensure that African Americans weren't just freed, but were also treated as full citizens with all the rights that entailed, an idea that was revolutionary and radical in the 1860s. Lincoln listened, and while he didn't make any promises, he left the meeting with much to think about. Let's pause for a moment of levity. Imagine the scene: Douglas, a man who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of his freedom, standing in the White House surrounded by portraits of past presidents, many of whom had owned slaves. It's the kind of irony that hits like a pie in the face. But Douglas wasn't there for the decor, he was there to change history. And let's not forget the economic angle here. Lincoln's administration was well aware that slavery was an economic powerhouse for the South, an engine driving their war effort. By undermining it, the Union could weaken the Confederacy's resolve and resources. It was less about moral high ground and more about a tactical advantage. Douglas understood this and used it to his advantage, framing the abolition of slavery as both a moral imperative and a pragmatic necessity. Now, the relationship between Douglas and Lincoln wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There was tension, a palpable undercurrent of skepticism from Douglas, who had spent his life fighting against the system Lincoln was now trying to navigate. But there was also a begrudging respect, a recognition that despite their differences, they were united in the goal of preserving the Union and ending slavery. Historically, Douglas's meetings with Lincoln were a testament to the power of dialogue, even when it feels like you're talking to a brick wall. His persistence in advocating for the rights of African Americans in the military paid off. By the war's end, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served in the Union Army, a crucial contribution to the North's victory. But let's not put on rose-colored glasses just yet. The fight for equal pay for black soldiers was a slog through a bureaucratic swamp. It wasn't until 1864 that Congress finally got its act together and granted equal pay, thanks in no small part to Douglas's relentless campaigning. It was a victory, sure, but one that came after much too long a delay, a reminder that progress often moves at a snail's pace, even when the need is urgent. So, what's the takeaway here? Douglas wasn't just rubbing elbows with the political elite for kicks. He was strategically leveraging his influence to chip away at the monolith of slavery. His meetings with Lincoln were more than just historical footnotes, they were pivotal moments that helped shape the course of the nation. As the Civil War raged on, Douglas continued to be a thorn in the side of complacency, prodding, pushing, and provoking. He was the embodiment of the idea that true change requires more than just rhetoric. It requires action, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. His political maneuvers during this period were as strategic as any military campaign, aimed at dismantling the economic and social structures that perpetuated slavery. And while Douglas was in the thick of it, he never lost sight of the bigger picture. He wasn't just fighting for the present, he was laying the groundwork for a future where freedom and equality weren't just words etched into the Declaration of Independence, but realities lived by all Americans. The stakes were high, the challenges immense, but Douglas never wavered. In the next chapter of this saga, the Civil War's end would bring new challenges, new battles. The country would face the daunting task of reconstruction, and Douglas would be there, ready to hold the nation's feet to the fire, ensuring that freedom was more than just a proclamation, but a promise fulfilled. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's leave Frederick Douglass in the midst of the storm, a beacon of determination in a sea of uncertainty, shaping the course of history with every step he took. Frederick Douglass stood like a lighthouse in a tempest, unyielding in the face of the storm that was post-Civil War America. The war might have ended, but the real battle for freedom and equality had just begun. Enter the Reconstruction era, where the United States tried to piece itself back together like a jigsaw puzzle missing a few crucial pieces. And who was there to help glue it all together? You guessed it, our man Douglas. Now, Reconstruction was supposed to be the nation's redemption arc. Think of it as America's very own reality show makeover, but instead of new haircuts and wardrobes, the aim was to rebuild the Southern economy and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into society. Spoiler alert, it was messier than a toddler's first birthday party. Douglas, ever the optimist and realist in equal measure, dove into this chaos with a vigor that could put a swarm of bees to shame. One of Douglas's main gigs during this time was advocating for the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, was like the shiny new lock on the door of citizenship, promising equal protection under the law for all Americans. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, was meant to safeguard the voting rights of African American men, a big deal considering that previously their chances of voting were about as realistic as finding a unicorn in Central Park. But here's where the plot thickens. The South, still reeling from the loss of its peculiar institution, wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for these changes. Instead, they were busy crafting black codes and, later, Jim Crow laws, effectively putting up a "do not enter" sign on the path to progress. Douglas, with his razor-sharp rhetoric, called out these injustices for what they were, a grotesque mockery of the very freedoms fought for during the Civil War. It's like winning a marathon only to have the finish line moved another mile down the road. Let's throw some numbers around. By the end of 1870, there were approximately 2,000 African Americans holding public office across the South, a remarkable leap from the zero they'd had before the war. Yet, this progress was as fragile as a soap bubble. The federal government, initially keen on enforcing Reconstruction, soon grew weary. The Compromise of 1877 saw the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively leaving African Americans to fend for themselves in hostile territory. It was a peace deal that felt more like abandonment. Douglas, never one to mince words, saw the writing on the wall. He recognized that the Reconstruction's supposed success was more of a PR campaign than a reality. He once remarked, "We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future." Translation: don't just pat yourself on the back for passing some laws, make sure they actually mean something. But Douglas wasn't just a domestic dynamo. Oh no, he had international ambitions too. In 1889, Douglas was appointed as the U.S. Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti. Yes, Haiti, the first independent black republic, a nation that had thrown off the shackles of colonial rule in a slave revolt that would make Spartacus proud. Douglas took on this diplomatic role with enthusiasm, seeing it as a chance to bolster ties between Haiti and the United States. However, this was no tropical vacation. Douglas's time in Haiti was fraught with challenges. The U.S. had a vested interest in acquiring the Mole St. Nicholas, a strategic port, but the Haitians weren't exactly eager to hand over the keys. Douglas faced the unenviable task of balancing American ambitions with Haitian sovereignty. He later resigned in frustration, citing the U.S.'s bullying tactics as a reason for his departure. So much for diplomacy being all about tea parties and handshakes. This stint in Haiti highlighted the often overlooked economic narratives at play. The U.S. wasn't just interested in Haiti out of the goodness of its heart, it was about strategic interests and economic gain. Douglas knew all too well that beneath the veneer of diplomatic niceties lay a complex web of power plays and economic jockeying. As Reconstruction came to a close, Douglas found himself grappling with the harsh realities of the era's setbacks. The dream of a fully integrated, equitable society was slipping through the fingers of history like sand. The rise of segregation laws and the entrenchment of racial prejudice were bitter pills to swallow for someone who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice. Douglas's legacy during this period was not one of unblemished triumph, but of relentless perseverance in the face of systemic adversity. He was like a master chess player, anticipating moves, countering threats, but always aware that the game was rigged against him. His work during Reconstruction and his diplomatic efforts in Haiti underscore the complexities of advocating for equality in a divided nation, a task as daunting as teaching a cat to fetch. And yet, Douglas never lost hope. He continued to speak out, to write, to push for change, knowing that the fight for equality was not a sprint but a marathon. He urged the nation to live up to its own ideals, to make the promises of freedom and equality more than just words etched in stone. As Douglas himself put it, where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. The story of Frederick Douglass in the Reconstruction era and beyond is a testament to the power of persistence. He navigated the treacherous waters of post-war America with a keen sense of purpose and an unwavering commitment to justice. His life was a continual struggle against the tide, a testament to the notion that progress is rarely linear and that the fight for equality is never truly over. As we leave Douglas at this juncture in history, it's clear that his story is far from finished. The challenges of the Reconstruction era set the stage for the even more turbulent years to come, but that's a tale for another time. For now, let's remember Douglas, not just as a figure from the past, but as a beacon of resilience and hope, a reminder that the quest for justice is a journey, not a destination. Frederick Douglass's journey of relentless advocacy didn't just fizzle out like a forgotten firework after the Reconstruction era. No, his legacy became the guiding star for countless future generations, even when the skies seemed perpetually overcast with doubt and division. Douglas's life was a masterclass in resilience, a living lesson that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is your own voice. But let's not fall into the trap of sugarcoating history with the sticky glaze of mythologizing. Sure, Douglas was a giant in the fight for equality, but he didn't descend from the heavens riding a unicorn of justice. He was a man, flesh and bone, navigating a world as complex as a Rubik's Cube with a missing piece. His writings and speeches were the tools of his trade, hammering away at the thick walls of ignorance and prejudice. Take his 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" A rhetorical Molotov cocktail thrown into the complacency of American patriotism. Douglas didn't mince words. He called out the hypocrisy of a nation celebrating freedom while millions remained shackled. He wasn't just a speaker, he was a truth-teller, even when the truth was as uncomfortable as a pebble in your shoe. Fast forward to today, and Douglas's words still echo with the clarity of a bell tolling for justice. His call for equality wasn't just for his time, it was a blueprint for the future. The issues he tackled, racism, inequality, the very definition of freedom, are still hot topics, smouldering away like coals beneath the surface of our modern society. Douglas understood that true progress was like an uphill marathon, where every step forward was hard-won, often leaving you breathless but ever closer to the summit. Let's talk numbers, because Douglas was a man who understood the power of data long before it was cool. His speeches were peppered with statistics, economic arguments, and practical realities that gave weight to his moral arguments. He knew that appealing to both heart and mind was the key to sparking change. It's like trying to sell a car. You need to highlight both the sleek design and the fuel efficiency. Douglas did just that, showing how slavery was not just a moral failure, but an economic blunder, a system that drained resources and stifled innovation. But what about the myth of the lone hero? It's a narrative as appealing as it is misleading. Douglas was often depicted as a solitary champion of freedom, but the truth is, he stood on the shoulders of countless others. He was part of a network of abolitionists, activists, and allies who supported his work and amplified his voice. His story is a reminder that change is never the result of one person alone, but the culmination of collective effort. It's like a symphony where every instrument plays a part, creating a harmony that resonates far beyond the concert hall. Now, Douglas's influence on later generations is as undeniable as gravity. The civil rights movement of the 20th century drew heavily from his teachings. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X walked paths Douglas had helped pave, borrowing from his rhetorical style and adopting his unwavering commitment to justice. Even today, activists cite Douglas as a source of inspiration. His life is a testament to the power of perseverance and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And let's not forget the economic implications of Douglas's work. He recognized that economic empowerment was crucial to achieving true equality. He advocated for education and self-improvement as means to break the cycle of poverty and dependence. Douglas understood that knowledge was power, a truth as relevant now as it was in his time. Investing in education was, and remains, one of the most potent ways to level the playing field. Douglas's vision of equality and justice wasn't a utopian daydream. It was a pragmatic strategy for societal transformation. He was acutely aware of the systemic barriers that needed dismantling and was strategic in his approach to doing so. He knew that the fight for equality was as much about changing laws as it was about changing hearts and minds. His legacy reminds us that while laws can mandate equality, it takes a shift in societal attitudes to make it a lived reality. As we reflect on Douglas's legacy, it's essential to embrace both the legend and the man. He wasn't infallible. His life was marked by struggles and setbacks. But it was his ability to rise from these challenges, to learn and adapt, that made him such an enduring figure. His story is a reminder that heroes are not born, they are forged in the fires of adversity. Douglas's life is a study in contrasts, a journey from the brutal realities of slavery to the halls of power. It's a narrative that defies simplistic categorization, much like the man himself. His legacy is a call to action, a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing and requires the courage to speak truth to power. In a world where the problems of inequality and injustice persist, Douglas's teachings are as vital as ever. So as we close the chapter on Frederick Douglass, let's carry forward his spirit of determination and hope. Let's honor his legacy by continuing the work he started, by striving for a world where freedom and equality are not just aspirations but realities. Douglas once said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." It's a message that resonates through time, urging us to keep pushing forward, to never settle for the status quo, and to always remember that the journey toward justice is a path worth walking, no matter how steep the climb. The cold air nips at your nose as you emerge from a restless sleep in your wooden hill fort, nestled on a windswept hill in 5th century Scotland. Forget about stone castles, they're so outdated, like the flip phones of ancient architecture. Your wooden abode is the cutting edge of Pictish chic, complete with drafty gaps that let in more cold than you'd like. You glance at the woolen cloak draped over a nearby stool, a testament to the meticulous craftsmanship of your tribe. Each thread is a small miracle of survival, keeping you warm as you face the day ahead. You throw on your cloak, feeling the weight of leadership, and wool settle on your shoulders. Breakfast is calling, and it's not a fancy affair. No avocado toast here, just a hearty bowl of porridge sweetened with precious honey. It's the kind of breakfast that sticks to your ribs, much like the responsibility of leading a tribe. As you eat, you mentally tally your assets. Forget about stocks or bonds. Your financial future quite literally moos and bars. Cows and sheep are the currency of the realm, and livestock is your 401k. In this world, power isn't measured by how many followers you have, but by the size of your herd. If you've got 100 cows grazing on the misty hills, you're practically the Rockefeller of the Pictish tribes. The economy is a barter system, more Craigslist than cryptocurrency. Trading isn't just a way to get goods, it's a dance of diplomacy, a strategy game where a well-timed sheep swap could secure an alliance with a neighboring tribe. Now, don't let romantic tales of heroic chieftains fool you. Being a Pictish leader isn't all feasting and warrior chants. It's more like being the CEO of an agrarian corporation, where every cow and sheep is a line on your balance sheet. A single cow could feed a family for months, or be exchanged for a sturdy new spear. Meanwhile, a sheep might not just give you wool, but could also be traded for a fine piece of Pictish jewelry to keep the family peace. As you finish your porridge, you ponder the Roman denarius, a shiny coin that's made its way north, clinking in the pockets of traders. Sure, it's a nice trinket, but try paying your warriors with coins when they'd much prefer a plump calf to roast. While the Romans might have ruled the world with their currency, up here in the highlands, livestock is what makes the world go round. And speaking of Romans, their stories about Picts are more propaganda than reality. They painted you as tattooed savages, fierce warriors who painted themselves blue and charged into battle with wild abandon. While there's a sliver of truth in the warrior spirit, the blue paint bit is mostly a myth, spun to make Roman soldiers seem more heroic in their victories. In reality, your leadership is as much about negotiation and strategy as it is about battle. So, as you strap on your leather boots and head out to oversee your lands, remember this: you're not just a chieftain, you're an economist, a diplomat, and occasionally a mythbuster. The hills stretch before you, dotted with your four-legged wealth. Each bleat and moo is a reminder that in this corner of the world, true power is as tangible as the wool on your back. And as you step into the brisk morning air, you realize that today, just like every other day, is about maintaining the delicate balance of power, livestock, and legend. As you step into the brisk morning air, the sun's ascent reminds you that it's time for a tribal council meeting. Forget about the sterile ambience of modern boardrooms. This is politics, Pictish style, where the stakes are as high as the hills around you. You don't just walk into these gatherings, you stride in, with the confidence of a leader who knows every cow and sheep in the tribe by name, or at least by bleat. The meeting place is a clearing, surrounded by ancient stones that seem to whisper tales of past councils. Here, the air is thick with the scent of peat smoke and the promise of heated debates. This isn't just about maintaining power, it's about mastering the art of Pictish diplomacy, where allegiances are as changeable as the Scottish weather, which, by the way, is still as unpredictable as ever. Druids might claim to have a handle on it, but let's be honest, predicting Scottish weather is akin to predicting the mood of a cat. Good luck with that. Your fellow chieftains arrive, each with their own entourage, a mix of warriors and advisors. The warriors are your tribe's version of social media influencers. With their woad-painted faces, they're the original trendsetters, setting the standard for intimidation chic. Their tattoos aren't just for show, they're a sort of visual resume, each mark telling a story of battles fought and won, or at least survived. These warriors are more than muscle, they're the embodiment of your tribe's reputation. Within the council, alliances form and dissolve faster than you can say Haggis. Today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, and vice versa. It's like playing a game of chess, but the pieces are living, breathing people, and the board is a rugged landscape of hills and glens. You're not just negotiating for power, you're bargaining for survival in a world where a single misstep could cost you everything. As discussions commence, the druids take their place. These enigmatic figures are part meteorologist, part legal counsel, and part mystic. Think of them as the Swiss Army knives of your society. They can predict, or at least pretend to predict, when the next storm will hit, or who might be plotting what behind your back. Druids are the ones who interpret omens and dreams, deciding whether that raven you saw this morning is a sign of good fortune or an ill omen. Spoiler alert, it's usually the latter. The council is like a medieval version of Survivor, with alliances forged and broken over the course of a single meeting. Today, you're hoping to secure a trade agreement with a neighbouring tribe. They're flush with cattle, and you've got enough surplus grain to make a deal worthwhile. But it's not just about goods, it's about fostering a relationship that might keep you from having to paint your face blue and charge into battle any time soon. During these negotiations, it's crucial to remember that everyone has an agenda. The chieftain sitting across from you might smile and nod, but he's also calculating how many warriors he'll need to take your land if the deal goes south. It's a delicate dance of words and gestures where every nod could signal agreement or deceit. You've got to stay sharp like a well-forged spear. Meanwhile, the druids are busy at work, casting bones and reading the patterns of the sky. They're the original life coaches, guiding your decisions with a mix of celestial wisdom and cryptic advice. Their role is vital. After all, when you're living in a world where the next rainstorm can turn your fields into a swamp, a little foresight is invaluable. But let's be real, asking a druid about the weather is like asking a toddler to predict stock market trends. Entertaining, but not exactly reliable. As the council progresses, it becomes clear that today's meeting is more than just a mere exchange of goods. It's a testament to the resilience and adaptability of your people. In a land where the weather is as fickle as the alliances, you've got to stay on your toes, ready to pivot at a moment's notice. It's a world where the legends of tattooed warriors and druidic wisdom coexist with the harsh reality of survival. By the time the sun begins its descent, the council has wrapped up, and you've managed to secure not just a trade deal, but a tentative alliance that might just keep your land safe for another season. As you make your way back to your hill fort, you reflect on the day's events. It's a reminder that leadership isn't just about wielding power, it's about navigating the complex web of human relationships, where every decision can be the difference between prosperity and ruin. So, as you step back into the familiar chill of your wooden fort, you realize that today's political dance is just one chapter in the ever-unfolding saga of Pictish life. The challenges are many, but so too are the opportunities. And as you settle in for the evening, you know that tomorrow will bring its own set of trials and triumphs, each one a chance to prove your mettle as a leader in this rugged, unpredictable world. As you settle in for the evening, letting the warmth of the hearth seep into your bones, your thoughts inevitably drift to the midday meal. Lunchtime in the Pictish world isn't just about filling your belly, it's a full-blown event, a smorgasbord of flavours, and a chance to chew over the lingering shadow of the Romans. Sure, they packed up their legions and left Britain in 410 AD, But their legacy? That's sticking around like the smell of last night's haggis. Today, the menu is a hearty stew with chunks of venison and root vegetables slow-cooked to perfection. As you dig in, you can't help but marvel at how food here is a communal affair, a time when the tribe gathers not just to eat, but to share stories and strategize. It's a reminder that, while your enemies might paint you as unsophisticated, the reality is far different. You could say your people have mastered the art of the potluck long before it became a suburban staple. But let's talk Romans. Their roads? You've got to hand it to them. Those straight-line fanatics were onto something. Sure, they were obsessed with efficiency, but in a land crisscrossed by hills and glens, a Roman road is like finding a flat path through a roller coaster. These roads are a gift that keeps on giving, turning what would be a day's hike into a brisk morning stroll. And Hadrian's Wall, that once imposing barrier? These days, it's less of a barricade and more of a convenient shortcut. It slices through the landscape like a Roman baguette, serving as the perfect backdrop for a scenic walk or a quick escape route if things get hairy. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The Romans love to spin tales about your people, the Picts painting you as wild, tattooed savages. Reality check, while tattoos might have been a thing, the notion of barbarism is a bit overblown. Your tribe is no stranger to organization and strategy. You've got chieftains who could give any Roman senator a run for their cestatiae in a debate. And the sophistication doesn't end there. Your tribe's art and craftsmanship are renowned, with intricate designs that would make any Roman mosaic look like a child's doodle. As the conversation at lunch turns to politics and power, the Romans' departure is still a hot topic. Their sudden exit left a vacuum, an opportunity for tribes like yours to rise in influence. It's a bit like when the popular kid leaves the party early, and suddenly there's room for others to step into the spotlight. But with great power comes great responsibility, or at least the need to constantly watch your back. You've got to deal with other tribes eyeing your territory and resources, all while maintaining the delicate balance of alliances and rivalries. The Roman relics scattered across the land are a constant reminder of their once mighty empire. There's a certain irony in using their own infrastructure to build your future. It's like inheriting a mansion from a distant relative and deciding to use it for wild parties instead of keeping it as a museum piece. You might not have their legions, but you've got the adaptability and resourcefulness to turn their leftovers into your treasures. As you mull over these thoughts, the conversation shifts to more immediate threats. The Saxons are pushing from the south, and while they're not quite the organized machine the Romans were, they're not to be underestimated. Your tribe's survival hinges on its ability to navigate the ever-shifting landscape of power. It's like playing a never-ending game of chess, where the pieces aren't just pawns and knights, but entire tribes and their leaders. The myth of the Picts as mere savages falls apart under scrutiny. You've got a complex society with its own rules and hierarchies. The Druids, those mystical figures who seem to hold the secrets of the universe in their heads, play an essential role in guiding the tribe. They're the keepers of knowledge, the ones who can read the stars and interpret the omens. Sure, their predictions are often vague, but hey, when you're dealing with the unpredictability of Scottish weather, any clue is better than none. As lunchtime winds down, you take a moment to reflect on the lessons of history. The Romans might have left, but their influence lingers like the aftertaste of strong ale. They were masters of propaganda, spinning tales to suit their narrative. But here, in the rugged beauty of Scotland, your tribe is writing its own story, a tale of resilience, adaptability, and a bit of cheeky humour. The Romans might have tried to paint you as barbaric, but the truth is your society is as rich and textured as the tapestries your craftsmen weave. Every thread tells a story, a reminder that history is written not just by the victors, but by those who dare to carve their own path. As you rise from the table, you know that the challenges ahead are many, but with each one comes an opportunity to prove that the Picts are more than just a footnote in someone else's history. And so, as the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the hills, you step back into the fray, ready to face whatever comes next. Tomorrow's battles might be fought with swords and shields, but today's victories are won with cleverness and cunning. In a world where the lines between legend and reality often blur, you're determined to ensure that your tribe's story is one worth telling. And who knows, maybe one day people will look back at the Picts and see not just warriors, but a people who thrived against all odds. As the afternoon sun dips lower, casting golden hues across the rugged hills, you find yourself gearing up for one of the more adrenaline-pumping aspects of Pictish life, the raid. This isn't just some weekend hobby, it's a full-fledged business operation, complete with economic strategies and a touch of theatrical flair. Forget about romanticized notions of noble warfare. This is about survival, plain and simple. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and a well-timed raid can secure resources faster than you can say livestock acquisition. Now, let's talk logistics. First off, you need a solid crew, a band of warriors ready to ride at a moment's notice. These folks aren't just muscle, they're the original venture capitalists, investing time and risk for a share of the spoils. The economics of raiding are as precise as a Roman sundial. Everyone knows the rules, a fair split of the loot, usually divvied up based on rank and contribution. The chieftain, that's you, gets a larger share, of course, leadership perks, right? But each warrior gets a cut depending on their role in the raid. If you're the one who snags the prize sheep or the best sword, you get a bit more jingle in your pouch. And let's not forget the getaway vehicles, horses. These trusty steeds are the sports cars of the 5th century, crucial for a quick escape. In the world of raiding, speed equals survival. A fleet-footed horse can mean the difference between a successful raid and a disastrous retreat. While your trusty steed might not have leather seats or a Bluetooth connection, it does offer one critical feature: it can outrun most trouble. Besides, nothing says, "We mean business," quite like charging into a neighbouring territory with a cavalry of warriors. Speaking of business, let's delve into the tools of the trade. Iron swords are your go-to. The AK-47s of their time, reliable, efficient and deadly. These weapons are forged with skill, each one a testament to the blacksmith's art. But let's not kid ourselves. Wielding an iron sword isn't just about slicing through enemy lines. It's as much about intimidation as it is about functionality. A well-crafted sword gleams in the sunlight, a psychological weapon that can make even the bravest opponent think twice. Then there are the shields. Forget about the hefty iron clunkers you might imagine. Picts prefer leather shields. Lightweight and maneuverable, they're more about swagger than protection. Sure, they might not stop a well-aimed arrow, but they're perfect for deflecting the occasional spear or club. Plus, they add a certain panache to your warrior ensemble. Picture this. A line of Pictish warriors, shields raised, blue paint streaked across their faces. It's enough to make any foe pause, at least for a moment. Ah, the infamous blue paint. The Romans spun tales of Picts charging into battle coated head to toe in blue woad, practically invincible. Spoiler alert, that's more myth than reality. While the paint might not grant supernatural powers, it does serve a purpose. It's a psychological tactic akin to modern-day war paint, a way to unsettle your enemies and boost your own morale. Plus, it's a handy identifier on the battlefield, ensuring you don't accidentally skewer one of your own. As you rally your warriors, there's a palpable energy in the air. A successful raid isn't just about the material gain, it's a reminder of your tribe's prowess and your leadership. It's a chance to assert dominance, to remind neighbouring tribes that the Picts are a force to be reckoned with. It's a bit like corporate branding, but with more swords and fewer PowerPoint presentations. The raid itself is a whirlwind of action. A well-planned strike, in and out before the enemy has a chance to muster a defence. You target a rival tribe's livestock, a few choice heads of cattle that can tip the scales of power in your favour. It's a high-stakes game of risk and reward, where each moo and bleat adds to your tribe's wealth and status. The return journey is a mix of triumph and tension. With the spoils of your raid in tow, you've got to remain vigilant. There's always the threat of a counter-raid or an ambush. But as you ride back towards your hill fort, the glow of success is undeniable. Today, your tribe has secured resources that will see you through the leaner months, a testament to the strategy, skill, and a touch of audacity. Back at the fort, the spoils are divided, and celebrations commence. It's not just about the victory. It's about reinforcing the bonds of your tribe, reminding everyone that, while the world beyond might be fraught with danger, within these wooden walls, there's strength and unity. The raid has not only bolstered your resources, but also your reputation, ensuring that your name will be whispered with respect across the highlands. And as night falls, you can't help but reflect on the dance of history. The myths and legends, the tales spun by Romans and others, are but one side of the story. The reality is far richer, more complex, a narrative of resilience, cunning, and a bit of calculated bravado. As the fire crackles and your people celebrate, you know that tomorrow will bring new challenges. But for tonight, you revel in the knowledge that, in this rugged land, you've carved out a place of power and promise. With the echoes of the day's triumph still lingering, you understand that the legacy of the Picts is one of adaptation and tenacity. As the embers glow and the stories are shared, you realize that each raid, each council, and each negotiation is a thread in the vast tapestry of your tribe's history. And so, as the night deepens, you steel yourself for the next chapter, ready to face whatever comes with the spirit of a true Pictish chieftain. As the fire crackles and the day's exploits fade into the soft murmur of night, you lean back, letting the warmth seep into your bones. Around you, the tribe gathers, faces illuminated by the flickering light, eyes wide with anticipation. It's storytelling time, the Pictish equivalent of primetime television, where tales of daring deeds and ancestral exploits flow as freely as the mead in your cup. This is where myths are born and legends grow legs, sometimes legs longer than reality would allow. Tonight, the stories begin with the great battles, the kind that make Hollywood epics seem like tame bedtime stories. There's one about your ancestor who allegedly fought off an entire Roman cohort single-handedly. Spoiler alert, the number of Romans probably shrinks with each retelling, but who's counting? The original tale might have involved a skirmish with a handful of scouts, but by the time it reaches your ears, it's a full-blown Spartacus moment. Still, these stories aren't just for entertainment. They're the glue that binds your tribe together, reinforcing shared values and instilling a sense of identity that runs deeper than any tattoo ink. Oral tradition is your tribe's version of a TED Talk, a platform for sharing wisdom, history, and occasionally the kind of exaggeration that'd make a fisherman blush. These tales serve a crucial role, a way to pass down knowledge in a world where paper is as rare as a sunny Scottish day. Each story is a lesson, a reminder of what it means to be a Pict. They're the original life hacks, teaching the young how to be brave, clever, and maybe a little bit audacious. But let's not kid ourselves. Mythology is a double-edged sword. While it strengthens community bonds, it can also blur the lines between fact and fiction. The Romans, for instance, loved their myths almost as much as their bards, spinning tales of the wild Picts to justify their own military failures. You've heard the one about Picts painting themselves blue and charging into battle like extras in a Braveheart scene gone wrong. The truth? A tad less theatrical. Yes, there might have been some face painting involved, but the idea of fighting in nothing but war paint is about as practical as wearing flip-flops in a snowstorm. As the night wears on, the stories shift from epic battles to everyday heroics. There's the tale of the chieftain who brokered peace with a rival tribe using nothing but his wits and a well-timed gift of cattle. Forget swords and shields in the Pictish world. Diplomacy is a weapon as sharp as any blade. It's a reminder that while legends often focus on blood and glory, the real victories are won in the quiet moments of negotiation and alliance building. In these tales, the line between heroism and pragmatism is as thin as a Pictish blade. You might not have the luxury of written records, but oral tradition ensures that your triumphs and trials echo through the ages. It's a bit like whispering secrets across a crowded room, hoping that they'll be heard and remembered long after you've gone. The stories also serve as a mirror, reflecting the values and fears of your society. They celebrate bravery and cunning, but they also caution against hubris and greed. They're about knowing when to fight and when to make peace, a lesson as relevant in the 5th century as it is today. As the firelight dances across the faces of your tribe, you can't help but wonder how your own story will be told. Will you be remembered as a noble chieftain, a master strategist who led his people through tumultuous times? Or will you be reduced to a footnote in Roman propaganda, a nameless barbarian lost to the sands of time? As the embers glow and the night grows deeper, you realize that history is indeed written by the victors and the good storytellers. The power of myth is its ability to transcend the mundane, to elevate the ordinary into the extraordinary. It's the alchemy that turns the base metal of daily life into the gold of legend. And in this, the Picts are alchemists of the highest order, weaving tales that will outlast the stones of your hill fort. reflecting on your place in history, you understand that while the Romans might have had their legions and their coins, your legacy is etched in the stories passed from one generation to the next. You might not have the grandeur of an empire, but you have something more enduring, a culture rich in resilience and adaptability, a people who thrive in the face of adversity. As the fire dims and the last stories are told, you realize that the night has imparted its own wisdom. The tales shared are as much about the future as they are about the past, guiding your tribe through the challenges that lie ahead. And in this moment, surrounded by your people, you know that while the path may be fraught with uncertainty, the spirit of the Picts will endure. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new stories waiting to be told. But for now, as the fire's glow fades and the stars emerge, you find solace in the knowledge that you are part of a lineage of storytellers and warriors, a tapestry of history woven with threads of courage and determination. And as you drift into sleep, the echoes of the night's tales linger, a reminder that in this world, the true measure of a chieftain is not just in deeds, but in the stories that keep the flame of your legacy alive. Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, not just the stuff of dusty textbooks or epic war movies. We're diving into a world where a single postal system tied together a landmass so vast it made the Roman Empire look like a postage stamp. At its height, the Mongol Empire sprawled over 12 million square miles, roughly the size of the African continent, and keeping tabs on such a domain wasn't about sending smoke signals or carrier pigeons. Nope, the Mongols had something much more sophisticated up their sleeves, the Yam, their very own express mail system. This was the medieval FedEx on steroids, and it was crucial for holding the empire together. Now, if you think the Mongols were just a bunch of horse-loving barbarians with a penchant for havoc, buckle up. This empire wasn't built solely on horseback raids and sweeping invasions. It thrived on logistics, the fine art of getting from point A to point B without losing your head, literally and figuratively. The Yam was Genghis Khan's brainchild, a testament to his vision of a connected empire. He was like the original project manager, except his team didn't have PowerPoint, just a lot of horsepower. You see, Genghis Khan understood that an empire was only as strong as its weakest communication link. With territories stretching from the East China Sea to the fringes of Eastern Europe, he needed rapid communication. Into the Yam, a network of way stations spread across the empire, spaced about 25 to 30 miles apart. This wasn't just a single dirt path with a few tired horses. We're talking a well-oiled machine of thousands of horses, riders, and stations. Riders could travel up to 200 miles a day, which in a time before Google Maps and gas stations was practically light speed. Each way station was stocked with fresh horses and provisions, allowing messengers to ride hard and fast, swapping out their exhausted horse for a fresh one like some sort of medieval pit stop. This system was so efficient that a message could travel from Mongolia's capital, Karakorum, to Beijing, a journey of over 700 miles in just a few days. Imagine that. The emperor could send a message, and by the time he finished his third yak butter tea, he'd already have a reply. But let's not romanticize it too much. This wasn't a cozy road trip with snacks and a playlist. The Yam was a logistical beast that demanded constant upkeep. Horses needed feeding and care. Way stations required staffing and supplies, and riders, often conscripted locals, faced the harsh realities of the steppe, brutal weather, bandits, and the occasional scuffle with a disgruntled nomad. This was no cushy job with benefits. The Yam was also an economic strain. Maintaining this network wasn't cheap. Think of it as the empire's subscription service, paid in blood, sweat, and the occasional tax hike. Yet its benefits were undeniable. It allowed the Mongols to maintain control over distant territories, facilitating trade, governance, and even espionage. Through the Yam, Genghis Khan could issue orders, receive intelligence, and keep his sprawling empire under a tight grip. It was the nervous system of the Mongol beast, the glue that held together its disparate parts. And while the Yam was an engineering marvel, it also served as a reminder of the empire's might. Imagine being a local chieftain, receiving a command from the Khan himself, delivered with unsettling speed and precision. It was a not-so-subtle reminder that the Mongols were always watching, always listening. In a world where communication often meant yelling across a field, the Mongol postal system was a revolution. It wasn't just about sending messages, It was about power, control, and the ability to project authority across thousands of miles. It was the internet of its day, connecting people, places, and ideas in ways previously unimaginable. So, while the image of a thundering horde of Mongol horsemen is undeniably compelling, the real story of their success lies in the quieter, less flashy details. The yam was one of those details, a testament to the Mongols' ingenuity and their understanding of what it took to run an empire that stretched across a third of the known world. It's a story of logistics and ambition, a network that was as impressive as the empire it served. And it all started with a visionary leader who realized that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a bow, but the ability to communicate, and do it faster than anyone else. In the grand tapestry of Mongol brilliance, the yam system was the thread that kept it all from unraveling. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of this medieval marvel, down to the very hoofbeats. We're talking relay stations every 20 to 30 miles. Yes, miles, not kilometers, because we're sticking to the original imperial system here, folks. These way stations were the beating hearts of the yam, ensuring that messages galloped across the empire with the urgency of a medieval pizza delivery. Hot, fresh, and impressively fast. Each of these stations was like a pit stop in the world's most intense relay race. Riders, known as yamchi, would dash in on their spent steeds, grab a fresh horse, perhaps gulp down some fermented mare's milk, not exactly a cappuccino, but it did the trick, and then bolt off again. It was a logistical ballet choreographed to perfection, and it needed to be. The Yamchi were the unsung heroes of the Mongol communication network, enduring grueling conditions that would make even the hardiest modern-day courier wince. The Yamchi themselves were a fascinating bunch. These weren't pampered postal workers with a nice desk job and a company mug. Nope, they were the daredevils of the steppe, often conscripted locals who had to prove they could handle the pressure and the speed. Picture this, a Yamchi could cover up to 200 miles in a single day. That's about 8 marathons back-to-back, with no cheering crowds or energy gels, just the wind in their hair and the endless horizon ahead. And they weren't just carrying love letters and tax notices. These riders were the nerve fibers of the Mongol Empire, delivering military commands, espionage reports, and sometimes secret messages that could tilt the balance of power. But let's be honest, the idea of a postal service on horseback sounds a bit absurd, doesn't it? I mean, imagine your local mail carrier showing up on a horse, borrowing from a Monty Python sketch. It's not exactly practical. Yet, for the Mongols, this was cutting-edge technology, and maintaining such a system came at a hefty price. We're talking about thousands of horses, all needing food and care, plus the constant upkeep of stations scattered across inhospitable terrain. It was like running a 13th century automotive industry, except the fuel was hay and the vehicles had minds of their own. The Mongols, ever the masters of efficiency, devised ingenious ways to keep their system running smoothly. They employed a kind of postal currency, a paisa, which was essentially a metal tablet granting the holder authority to requisition horses and supplies along the route. Think of it as the first ever frequent rider program. Riders with a paisa were like VIPs of the yam, entitled to the best horses and the warmest yurts. It was a sign of power and privilege as much as it was a practical tool. Now, let's sprinkle in a few humorous anecdotes because the yam, for all its efficiency, was not without its quirks. There were tales of Yamchi who took their duties a little too seriously, racing through villages with the kind of reckless abandon that would make a Roman chariot driver blush. One rider famously barreled through a campfire, singeing his horse's tail but refusing to slow down. Talk about dedication! Another Yamchi reportedly outran a pack of wolves, losing his pants in the process. The message, however, arrived on time and intact. Priorities, right? And then there were the mishaps. Horses aren't machines, they have minds of their own. There were instances when a horse, perhaps tired of the postal grind, decided to take a detour, leaving the rider stranded in the middle of nowhere. Or occasions when a Yamchi, lulled by the monotonous rhythm of hooves, dozed off only to wake up miles off course. These stories, while amusing now, highlight the human element behind the legendary system, an element often glossed over in grand historical narratives. The yam wasn't just a triumph of logistics, it was a testament to the Mongol genius for adaptation and innovation. It showcased their ability to harness the natural world and bend it to their will. but it also revealed the empire's vulnerabilities. Maintaining such a vast network was a constant struggle, a delicate balance of power, resources, and human endurance. It was a reminder that even the mightiest empires rely on the simplest of systems to hold them together. Yet, despite the absurdities and challenges, the Yam was a cornerstone of Mongol power. It allowed the empire to project its influence across continents, linking the far-flung corners of its domain in a web of communication and control. It was both a symbol of authority and a practical tool for governance, a duality that defined much of Mongol strategy. As we continue to explore the intricate workings of the Yam, remember that this wasn't just a postal system. It was a lifeline for an empire that defied the odds, an example of how vision and pragmatism can transform the impossible into the everyday. And while the riders may have been the unsung heroes, their legacy endures, a testament to the power of communication in shaping history's grand narratives. So, while the Yam system may have been the literal backbone of the Mongol Empire, it wasn't just about keeping the mail carriers busy. This medieval marvel had political and social ramifications that stretched as far as the empire itself. You see, the Yam wasn't simply about sending "wish you were here" postcards from the Khan. It was a sophisticated tool of governance and control, a communication superhighway that played a pivotal role in maintaining Mongol domination. First, let's talk politics. Genghis Khan and his successors weren't content with just conquering land and calling it a day. They had ambitions, and those ambitions required governance. The Yam allowed them to project their authority across vast distances with unnerving speed. Think of it as the original red phone in the White House, only this one was made of horsehide and leather. Orders from the Khan could reach the farthest corners of the empire in record time, ensuring that local governors and military commanders knew exactly what was expected of them. And woe to anyone who dared ignore a command delivered by a Yamchi, because the speed of the message was a not-so-subtle indicator of the sender's power. This rapid communication wasn't just about cracking the whip. It also allowed the Mongols to respond swiftly to rebellions or unrest. Imagine being a rebellious tribal leader, thinking you've got a few weeks before news of your insurrection reaches the capital, only to find Mongol forces already pounding on your door. Surprise! The Yam was the empire's early warning system, its eyes and ears, allowing the central authority to keep an iron grip on its territories. But the Yam wasn't just a tool of suppression, it was also a means of integration. By connecting the far-flung regions of the empire, it helped to foster a sense of unity, albeit one enforced by the threat of Mongol retribution. Trade routes flourished along the Yam roads, as merchants piggybacked on the infrastructure laid out for the postal system. Goods, ideas, and cultures flowed more freely than ever before, turning the Mongol Empire into a melting pot of languages, religions, and traditions. So, while the Yam kept the empire's subjects under the watchful eye of the Khan, it also helped to create a more interconnected world. Now, let's debunk a common myth, the idea that Mongol postal riders were just glorified messengers. Sure, they carried letters and orders, but they were also the empire's intelligence agents. These riders were the 13th century equivalent of James Bond, minus the tuxedo and martini. As they galloped through the vast expanse of the steppe, they gathered information, listened to local gossip, and reported back on the mood of the populace. They were the eyes and ears of the Khan, noting any signs of dissent or potential uprising. It wasn't all horse sweat and dust. There was a cerebral element to their work, a constant assessment of the political landscape. Picture this: a Yamchi riding into a bustling market, blending in with the locals, and casually picking up bits of conversation. What seemed like idle chatter could be invaluable intelligence. These riders were trained to be discreet and observant, their minds as sharp as their riding skills. And when they returned to their way stations, they didn't just hand over a satchel of letters. They delivered reports that could influence military strategy and political decisions. In this way, the Yam wasn't just a postal system, it was a network of spies, each rider a node in the empire's vast intelligence web. The espionage aspect of the Yam highlights its role in military strategy. The Mongols were masters of psychological warfare, and the Yam was an integral part of their playbook. By gathering intelligence and relaying it with lightning speed, they could outmaneuver their enemies, striking where their foes least expected it. The Yam provided the Mongols with a strategic edge, allowing them to coordinate attacks and reinforce positions with unprecedented efficiency. In a world where battles were often won by the side with the best information, the Yam was a game-changer. However, maintaining such a sprawling network wasn't cheap. The Mongols had to keep thousands of horses fed and healthy, ensure that way stations were adequately staffed and supplied, and make sure that the riders themselves were up to the task. This required a well-organized bureaucracy, something that might surprise those who think of the Mongols as purely nomadic warriors. The Yam was a testament to their ability to manage resources and logistics on a massive scale. It was an empire-wide operation, a constant balancing act of supply and demand that required meticulous planning and execution. But let's not forget the human element. The Yamchi, those intrepid riders of the steppe, were often locals conscripted into service. They faced grueling conditions, from searing heat to biting cold, all while dodging bandits and wild animals. It was a tough job, but one that came with a certain prestige. The paisa, that little metal tablet of authority, granted them privileges and protections. It was a status symbol, a sign that they were part of something larger than themselves. And while they may not have worn capes, these riders were the unsung heroes of the Mongol Empire, their efforts crucial to its success. So, there you have it. The Yam wasn't just a postal system, it was the lifeblood of the Mongol Empire. It was a tool of governance, a means of integration, a network of spies, and a cornerstone of military strategy. It connected the empire's disparate parts, ensuring that the Khan's will was carried out swiftly and effectively. And while the riders may have been the ones in the saddle, it was the vision of leaders like Genghis Khan that kept the whole thing running. As we continue this journey through the annals of Mongol history, remember that the Yam was more than just a means of communication. It was a testament to the power of connectivity in an age where distance was often an insurmountable barrier. Now, if you think the Yam was just about letters and orders, think again. This medieval marvel was the Mongol Empire's backstage pass to the world of cultural exchange. It's not just about galloping horses and dusty riders, it's about ideas, traditions, and the occasional traveller who stumbled upon this express highway of history. And speaking of travellers, let's not gloss over one of the most famous of them all, Marco Polo. Marco, the original influencer, whose travel tales would make even the most seasoned Instagrammer envious. Now, Marco Polo's accounts of his travels through the Mongol Empire have become the stuff of legend. We're talking about a guy who journeyed over 15,000 miles before GPS and TripAdvisor were even a twinkle in anyone's eye. But here's the kicker. His stories are often sprinkled with a dash of exaggeration. We're not saying Marco was a liar, but let's just say he knew how to spin a tale. He claimed the Mongol roads were lined with gold, and that Kublai Khan's court was a veritable paradise of wealth and opulence. The reality? Not quite as sparkly. Sure, the Yam system did facilitate his journey, allowing him to travel swiftly across the vast Mongolian steppe. But let's not forget the gritty details, the dust storms, the bandits, the less than 5-star accommodations. Marco wasn't exactly lounging in luxury, despite his glamorous depictions. His accounts, while captivating, need to be taken with a grain of salt and maybe a shot of reality. Yet, Marco Polo's stories did serve a purpose. They shone a light on the Mongol Empire's cosmopolitan nature, highlighting the cultural exchanges that the Yam made possible. The system wasn't just a postal service, it was a superhighway for ideas. Along these routes, merchants traded spices and silk, scholars exchanged knowledge, and religions spread their doctrines. The Mongol Empire became a melting pot, a cultural stew that simmered with influences from Persia, China, and the Arab world. Let's pause for a second to appreciate the scale of this exchange. We're talking about an empire that spanned continents from the Middle East to the Far East, and the Yam was the thread stitching this diverse tapestry together. Goods like Chinese silk and Persian rugs didn't just move along these roads, they transformed them into bustling arteries of commerce. And where goods went, ideas followed. Philosophers and poets, mathematicians and astrologers all found their way into the Mongol domain thanks to the Yam. This cultural exchange wasn't just a one-way street. The Mongols themselves were remarkably open to new ideas, adopting innovations that caught their fancy. For instance, They embraced advancements in siege warfare from the Chinese, culinary techniques from the Persians, and even administrative practices from the Persians and Arabs. It was a two-way traffic of influence, a testament to the Mongols' pragmatic approach to empire building. But before we get too misty-eyed about this cultural harmony, let's ground ourselves in some reality. The Mongols weren't exactly running a charity. This exchange had an economic aspect too. By facilitating trade and cultural interaction, they bolstered the empire's economy and reinforced their own power. The yam was an investment, a way to ensure that the empire remained financially viable and culturally vibrant. And let's not forget the political angle. The Mongols understood that a connected empire was a stable one. By promoting cultural exchange, they fostered a sense of unity among their diverse subjects. The yam was their tool for weaving together the empire's disparate strands, creating a sense of interconnectedness that was as much about control as it was about cooperation. But what about the darker side of this exchange? For all the talk of cultural flowering, the yam also facilitated the spread of less savoury elements. Disease, for instance, travelled just as swiftly as goods and ideas. The Black Death, which decimated Europe in the 14th century, likely hitched a ride along the very trade routes the yam made possible. It's a grim reminder that connectivity can cut both ways, bringing both prosperity and peril. Despite these challenges, the Mongol Empire's cosmopolitan nature was undeniable. The yam was its lifeline, a conduit for not just information but also the very essence of cultural interaction. It was a testament to the Mongols' ambition, their ability to harness the power of connectivity in an age when most empires struggled to communicate beyond their own borders. So, while Marco Polo's tales might be a bit over the top, they capture the essence of the Mongol Empire's cultural vibrancy. The yam was more than just a postal service, it was a bridge between worlds, a channel through which ideas flowed as freely as the horses that galloped along its routes. As we wrap up this cultural odyssey, remember that the yam was a marvel of its time. It wasn't just about speed and efficiency, it was about the exchange of ideas, the blending of cultures, and the forging of connections that went far beyond the physical realm. The Mongols, with their keen understanding of logistics and communication, created a system that was as much about minds as it was about messages. And while we've only scratched the surface of this complex and fascinating chapter in history, there's more to explore. The yam, in all its glory and grit, remains a testament to the power of communication and the enduring impact of cultural exchange. As we ride further into the Mongol Empire's history, let's keep our eyes on the horizon. There's plenty more to discover. In the grand cacophony of history, where empires rise and fall like waves upon the shore, the Mongol yam system is one of those rare stories where logistics meets legend. It's as if Genghis Khan took a look at the vast stretches of his empire and decided, why not turn this into the world's biggest communication experiment? And boy did he ever. What began as a simple relay system became the nerve center of one of history's largest empires, and its legacy is a testament to the power of a well-oiled machine, one that ran on hooves and dust instead of silicon and satellites. When we think of modern postal systems, with their sleek vans and digital tracking, it's hard to imagine their roots tracing back to Mongol horsemen thundering across the steppes. Yet, there it is, an undeniable connection. The yam's relay system, where riders swapped horses at way stations, echoes in the logistics of modern delivery services. The idea of relays and hubs is as relevant today as it was back then. The Mongols were essentially the grand architects of the first express mail service, paving the way for everything from the Pony Express to FedEx. It's a bit like discovering your great-grandfather was the original rock star, unexpected but undeniably cool. Yet, while the yam was a marvel of efficiency, it wasn't all galloping glory. The harsh realities faced by those who maintained it were as daunting as the system was innovative. Riders, or yamchi, faced treacherous conditions from scorching summers to biting winters. They weren't exactly clocking in for cushy desk jobs. This was extreme sports meets postal service. And let's not forget the economic toll. Maintaining thousands of horses and way stations wasn't a small feat. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of maintaining a fleet of trucks and warehouses. The cost was a constant burden on the empire's coffers, and the taxation required to support it wasn't exactly celebrated by the locals. But the yam story doesn't end in the dust of the steppes. Its influence rippled across time, inspiring future communication networks. The concept of a centralized, efficient postal system was revolutionary, and it set a precedent that empires and nations would strive to replicate. The Persian courier systems, the Roman cursus publicus, and even the Ottoman Empire's Tatar couriers were echoes of the Mongol innovation. The yam proved that communication wasn't just about sending messages, it was about establishing control, facilitating trade, and ensuring the smooth running of a vast empire. Of course, the yam wasn't invincible. As the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented, so too did its legendary postal network. The system that had once connected the continent crumbled under the weight of political instability and economic strain, but its legacy endured, a reminder that even the most impressive systems are vulnerable to the tides of history. The yam's decline was a slow unraveling, like a once great orchestra losing its conductor. It serves as a poignant reminder that the infrastructure of an empire is only as strong as its leadership. And so, as we reflect on the legacy of the yam, it's clear that its mark on history is indelible. This ancient system, born from the mind of a visionary leader, managed to span continents and connect people in ways previously unimaginable. It was a marvel of its time, a feat of logistics and ingenuity that left an enduring legacy. The yam system shows us that the art of communication is both timeless and transformative, an essential thread in the fabric of human civilization. In today's world, where communication is instantaneous and borders blur with the click of a button, it's easy to forget the monumental effort it once took to connect people across vast distances. The yam reminds us that behind every message there are stories of human endurance, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of connection. So next time you track a package on your smartphone, spare a thought for the yamchi galloping across the steppes, bearing messages that shaped the course of empires. In the end, the Mongol postal system was more than just a means of communication. It was a vision of what could be achieved when ambition met innovation. And there you have it. The yam, a postal system that was as much a product of its harsh realities as it was of its soaring ambitions. It was a testament to the Mongols' understanding that an empire wasn't just land and conquest, but the ability to communicate across that land with speed and certainty. So, while the horses have long since stopped galloping and the way stations have faded into history, the spirit of the yam gallops on, a legacy etched into the DNA of modern communication. Not bad for a bunch of horse-loving visionaries, right?